Ah, the tomato. Today, it's the soul of your spaghetti, the beating heart of your pizza, the red splatter on your fries that makes life worth living. But in the Victorian era, that cheerful little fruit might as well have worn a tiny black cloak and carried a scythe, because for a good chunk of the 19th century, tomatoes were seen not as a tasty treat, but as murder with a stem. Hello travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this. And hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Starting with the strangest, juiciest myth of them all. Tomatoes were believed to be poisonous, not because they were inherently dangerous, but because of what they touched. You see, upper-class Victorians loved to dine on pewter plates. Pewter, back in the day, wasn't the harmless metal blend we use for novelty mugs now. No, it was a delightful cocktail of tin. That's right, big, juicy helpings, served directly underneath your lamb shanks. Enter the tomato, stage left. Tomatoes are naturally acidic, just enough to do what acidic things do best, react with metals. When a tomato came into contact with pewter, it would leach out that sweet. This wasn't an instant kaboom type situation, but over time people started to mysteriously keel over after meals. They'd have fevers, convulsions, memory loss, the usual symptoms of maybe don't eat that. Doctors had no idea what was going on. Science was still figuring out germs existed, let alone how metal poisoning worked. And because correlation loves to dress up as causation at dinner parties, the tomato took the blame, not the plates. Nope, the fruit was guilty by proximity. Imagine being framed for a crime your plate committed. It's like being blamed for arson because you brought marshmallows. So the tomato got slapped with a dark and juicy reputation. Nicknames floated around like poison apple, which sounds like something you'd feed a princess if you were trying to inherit her castle. Some even believed the tomato's bright red color was nature's warning label, like frogs, stop signs, and your mother's angry lipstick. To many Victorians, the tomato wasn't food. It was a suspicious red orb of digestive Russian roulette. Now it wasn't just the pewter. Snobbery helped squeeze more juice into the tomato's downfall. You see, tomatoes were foreign, imported, exotic. They didn't grow neatly in the English countryside like potatoes or cabbage. They came from the Americas, dragging along their spicy reputation and history with them. And nothing makes the upper class more nervous than food with a passport. The tomato's New World origin already had it working uphill. Many English folks still linked it with indigenous practices, colonial gardens, and less refined cultures. Translation: peasants eat it, so we shall not. This kind of culinary gatekeeping was the Victorian equivalent of turning your nose up at pineapple on pizza, only with actual fear of death involved. Plus, it didn't help that the tomato was part of the nightshade family. You know, that delightful plant family that also includes belladonna, a plant literally named beautiful woman, that causes hallucinations, paralysis, and the occasional flatline. That's like saying, oh, don't worry, this mushroom is technically related to the death cap, but I swear it's fine on toast. So combine the pewter problem, foreign food xenophobia, and plant family guilt by association, and you've got yourself a fruit that would have needed the best PR team in Victorian England just to make it into a stew. But alas, no Instagram chefs existed to throw a tomato into a ring light and whisper, don't be afraid, it's just a caprese. What makes this all even funnier in hindsight is that the fear wasn't universal. In some parts of the world, especially among working-class communities and Italian immigrants, tomatoes were already a staple. People were eating them, living, and even thriving. But for many proper Victorians, the fruit was treated with more caution than an unchaperoned corset party. Ironically, the same aristocrats who wouldn't touch a tomato were just fine gobbling down things like boiled calves' heads and meat jelly. Tomatoes were off the table, but you could absolutely serve up a dish of trembling grey aspic, and people would say, ah yes, splendid texture. So to recap, tomatoes weren't dangerous on their own. The danger came from the dinnerware, and arguably, the egos. If you ate one off a wooden plate or straight from the vine, chances are you'd survive. But put that same tomato on a lead-laced dish, and suddenly it was a red-tinged game of Clue. It was the tomato, in the dining room, with the salad fork. The good news? Science eventually caught up. The bad news? It took way too long. before the tomato made its awkward red carpet debut on Victorian dinner tables, where it was accused of poisoning people via silverware sabotage, it already had a thriving second career, witchcraft's favourite fruit. Long before it was diced into salsa or snuck into unsuspecting toddlers' pasta sauce, the tomato was rumoured to be many things: a powerful aphrodisiac, a cursed love fruit, a devilish temptation, and occasionally the stand-in for sin itself. Quite a resume for something you can now get sliced on a sandwich for $1.50. In fact, in many parts of Europe and the early British colonies, the tomato wasn't even called a tomato. It went by far more dramatic titles: the apple of love, the wolf peach, and for the truly dramatic, the devil's fruit. That last one really sold it short on the salad front, but boy did it do wonders for tomato-themed horror stories. Let's start with the nickname Apple of Love. Sounds romantic, right? The kind of thing you'd find engraved on a Victorian Valentine's Day card if you squinted past the lace and the tuberculosis. But in truth, the term came from a blend of myth and miscommunication. The Italian name pomodoro was translated as golden apple, and the French pomme d'amour, which literally means apple of love, only added fuel to the folklore. People began to associate tomatoes with lust, desire, and steamy rendezvous, often completely ignoring the fact that most tomatoes didn't even taste that good back then. Romance was hard in the 1800s. Sometimes you had to flirt with vegetables. Naturally, this led to the tomato becoming a key ingredient in folk love potions. That's right, while modern romance involves awkward texting and dodging social interaction, your Victorian great-great-grandmother may have been tossing a bit of tomato pulp into a pocket spell to win the heart of that mysterious gentleman who tipped his hat extra slowly. Folklore claimed that carrying a tomato on your person, or better yet, sneaking a bit of tomato juice into your crush's food, could ignite passion. This wasn't science, this was vibes, and maybe a little bit of accidental ketchup. Tomato-based love charms weren't just symbolic, they were believed to trigger physical reactions, awaken desire, and occasionally summon unwanted side effects, like mild confusion or actual food poisoning. But hey, that's love, baby. Of course, not everyone saw the tomato as Cupid's sidekick. For some, it was Lucifer's lunchbox. Religious types in the Victorian era, especially the kind who got nervous when your curtains were too brightly patterned, saw the tomato as dangerously sensual. Red was already associated with temptation, sin, and basically every Bible story that ended badly. The tomato's plump, juicy appearance didn't help. It was practically shouting, "Eat me and let your morals burn." And so, in some rural circles, tomatoes became a symbol of forbidden knowledge, of temptation too risky to entertain. It was the hidden apple with extra juiciness, and the occasional worm. You didn't just avoid eating tomatoes, you avoided even planting them. Certain communities believed growing them could attract bad luck, spiritual corruption, or at the very least, some nosy old woman accusing you of making soup for Satan. But we're not done yet, because tomatoes weren't only used in love spells, they also featured in protective charms and counter curses, depending on where you were. In parts of the UK, people believed you could use a tomato to absorb evil energies. The idea was that the tomato, much like a sponge, or that one overly dramatic friend we all have, would soak up negativity until it shriveled and died, kind of like your optimism during exam season. Some households even placed tomatoes on windowsills to ward off witches or evil spirits. You heard that right. Tomatoes, those round little chaos orbs, were used as ghost repellents. The logic being, if it scares the Victorian upper class, surely it must scare the undead too. Now imagine being a tomato in this time period. You've been banned from the kitchen, accused of seduction, labelled demonic, stuffed into someone's undergarments as a spell component, and expected to double as a security system. That's a lot of pressure for something that bruises if you even look at it wrong. Victorian superstitions were nothing if not creative. In an age where science was still trying to prove germs weren't imaginary, and hysteria was treated with smelling salts and vague sighing, the tomato became a cultural Rorschach test. Love it, fear it, bless your house with it. Just don't eat it. That came later. Because nothing says romance like handing your crush a tomato and whispering, "May your loins burn," with love. Every so often in history, someone does something so bold, so outrageous, so absolutely unnecessary, It ends up saving an entire food group. Enter Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, a man with the fashion sense of a boot-polishing aristocrat and the guts of someone willing to die for a fruit. Or technically, a fruit that everyone thought was out to kill him. The year was 1820, and the place was Salem, New Jersey, a town now mostly known for this exact story. At the time, tomatoes were still trapped in a web of bad PR. Americans had inherited the same European suspicion toward them. Bright red, overly juicy, a little too foreign-looking for comfort. They'd been nicknamed things like love apples and wolf peaches, which sounds like something you'd name your fantasy novel character, not your lunch. The consensus: tomatoes were poisonous, dangerous, and best left as creepy ornamental plants in your garden, rather than anywhere near your digestive tract. But Robert Gibbon Johnson was not having it. This was a man of reason, a man of science, a man who, legend has it, decided that the best way to prove tomatoes weren't deadly was to eat an entire basket of them in public, with the kind of confidence usually reserved for Olympic gymnasts or overly confident toddlers about to fall off furniture. And so, on a bright September afternoon, Colonel Johnson stepped onto the courthouse steps of Salem with his tomato basket in hand, and a crowd of concerned citizens watching like they were about to witness a live execution. According to some accounts, 2,000 people gathered, which for a sleepy New Jersey town in the 1820s was basically the whole population plus a few confused cows. The townsfolk were reportedly horrified. Local doctors stood by, fully expecting Johnson to writhe in agony and die on the spot. Some say a town official begged him to reconsider. Others claim women in the audience fainted. Whether those faintings were from fear or from the heat, because corsets and summer are not friends, we'll never know. But Johnson was unshaken. He stood tall, reached into the basket, and bit into a tomato like it was an act of patriotic martyrdom. Juice ran down his chin. The crowd collectively held its breath. One tomato down, then another, then another. The man was putting on a show. Think David Blaine, but instead of being buried alive or holding his breath underwater, Johnson was just casually destroying centuries of botanical paranoia, one bite at a time. And the twist, he didn't die, not even a burp. Instead, he wiped his hands, smiled at the still silent crowd, and strolled away like nothing had happened. It was the culinary equivalent of walking away from an explosion in slow motion. The man had eaten a fruit everyone assumed was murder in spherical form, and he walked off like he just won a chili cook-off. Of course, not everyone clapped. The skeptics didn't immediately start tomato farming the next day, but something strange did happen. The tomato's image began to change. Slowly, hesitantly, like someone peeking out from behind a curtain. Johnson's stunt didn't rewrite American cuisine overnight, but it did become a powerful story, a tomato baptism that showed people maybe they were being just a little bit ridiculous. Now, historians today debate the full accuracy of this tale. Some claim the event might have been exaggerated, or even entirely apocryphal, a local legend cooked up with just enough truth to make it taste like history. But whether Johnson really stood on the courthouse steps or not, the story stuck, and in the grand tradition of food-related folklore, sticking is half the battle. Over the next few decades, as immigrants brought their love of tomatoes with them, especially from Italy, the fruit's deadly reputation started to fade. Recipes began to appear. Tomato sauce crept its way into stews, soups, and eventually onto that sacred dough circle we now call pizza. But Johnson's stunt remains a symbolic turning point. The day someone risked death by tomato in front of a crowd just to prove a point. Let's be real. Would you eat a fruit in front of your entire town if everyone believed it would kill you? Would you do it for science? For progress? For future lasagna? Johnson did. That man looked into the abyss of tomato terror and said, "Pass the salt. Let's talk food, but not the fun kind. Not the kind that makes your eyes light up or your stomach do a happy little wiggle. No, this is Victorian food. The kind that was more endurance challenge than celebration. A culinary era defined not by flavor but by fear, and nothing symbolized this edible anxiety more than the glaring, saucy absence of one thing, the tomato. Now to modernize. This seems absurd. How do you even cook without tomatoes? What do you smear on your sandwich? What anchors your soup? What, dear God, do you dip your chips in? But for Victorians, the tomato wasn't just avoided. It was deliberately exiled, like a scandalous cousin. No one talked about, but everyone secretly wondered what happened to. Open a Victorian cookbook from the early to mid-1800s, and you'll find it reads less like a recipe guide, and more like the diary of someone in a committed relationship with beige, boiled mutton, stewed beef, peas with more crust than purpose, and if you're lucky, a limp cabbage making a guest appearance. What you won't find, at least not prominently, is the tomato. It was as if the tomato had done something truly unforgivable, like vote or speak French at dinner. Despite its widespread availability and successful cultivation in both England and America, Victorian-era cuisine mostly kept the tomato at arm's length. It wasn't until the very late 19th century that the tomato began tiptoeing into recipes with any regularity, and even then, it was treated with the kind of suspicion typically reserved for mysterious uncles and political pamphlets. Why the cold shoulder? Simple tomatoes were still culturally taboo, associated with lower-class immigrants, dangerous ideas, and far too much flavour. The British culinary mindset of the time was built on blandness. Spice was suspicious, zest was threatening, and the tomato, with its bold colour, tangy taste, and foreign roots, was just too much. It made things exciting. It made things red, and excitement was not on the Victorian menu. You might wonder, was there no loophole? Was there really zero tomato presence in these menus of meat, mush, and pudding? Surprise! Ah, dear listener, there was a twist. Ketchup. Yes, ketchup. But hold the celebration. This wasn't your thick, sugary, fries-loving friend. Victorian ketchup, or catsup, for the fancy and unbothered, was often made with mushrooms, walnuts, or anchovies. That's right, anchovy ketchup, a sauce that could legally be classified as a crime today. Tomatoes were only one of many possible bases for early ketchup, and they weren't even the most common. In fact, the earliest ketchup recipes looked more like what happens when you ask a blindfolded chef to guess what savory means. Mushroom ketchup was especially popular, and tasted vaguely like Worcestershire sauce after a long day. Tomato ketchup didn't really start to dominate until Heinz came along and bottled it in 1876. But even then, there was a disconnect. You could buy tomato ketchup, but you still didn't cook with actual tomatoes. It was culinary catfishing at its finest. Back in domestic kitchens, however, tomato avoidance was still in full swing. Menus leaned hard into boiled meats, suet puddings, and root vegetables, so overcooked they could have been used as doorstops. It wasn't just flavour that was under attack. It was colour, texture, joy. Tomatoes offered the terrifying possibility of brightness, of acidity, of flavour profiles. These were not the goals of Victorian home cooks. The goal was to get through dinner without fainting from emotional stimulation. And God help you if you tried to get creative. A woman tossing chopped tomato into a stew in the 1840s might as well have declared allegiance to chaos. She'd be accused of experimenting, of copying foreign trends, of trying to seduce someone with sauce. This was an era when food was meant to nourish the body, not awaken the senses. In Victorian terms, the tomato was practically a scandal in vegetable form. Yes, we know it's technically a fruit, but try explaining that to a 19th century housemaid while she's boiling beef tongue. Even restaurant chefs hesitated. Tomato dishes were considered exotic, a word that in Victorian England meant suspicious and probably immoral. If a gentleman dined at a place offering stuffed tomatoes, he might raise an eyebrow and whisper, "Is this establishment French?" followed by fainting into his soup. And so, the tomato remained locked outside the culinary kingdom, peeking through the barred windows of the recipe books, while the meat jelly and suet puddings danced inside to the flavourless tunes of the time. It would take immigration, innovation, and the gradual loosening of culinary corsets before the tomato would finally be invited back in, not as a novelty or a side note, but as a proud ingredient with nothing to prove and everything to flavour. Let's set the scene. You're a Victorian gentleman, sipping your tea, or perhaps a corseted lady trying not to faint before lunch, and you glance at the local newspaper, sandwiched between announcements of freak hailstorms, runaway pigs, and advertisements for miracle moustache tonics, is something truly horrifying. Dead after dinner. Local man succumbs to mysterious sauce. Red fruit of death claims another life. You won't believe what this new vegetable is doing to aristocrats. Victorian media may not have had the internet, but it absolutely pioneered the art of sensationalism, especially when it came to food. and few foods got dragged harder through the inky tabloids of the 19th century than the innocent, crimson, tragically misunderstood tomato. The tomato didn't just have a PR problem, it had a full-blown media witch hunt. Early newspapers were not, let's say, obsessed with facts. Editors knew that a whisper of drama sold more copies than any honest vegetable ever could, and what could be more tantalizing than a juicy red fruit that might murder you in your own dining room? The press leaned into the tomato terror like it was a national pastime. Even without formal scientific consensus or confirmed fatalities, stories spread like gossip at a garden party. Lady Collingwood dies after supper, cause unknown, but her plate was red. Footman violently ill after tasting foreign sauce, likely tomato exposure. These headlines, real or embellished, stirred up anxiety, fueled social fears, and made tomatoes sound like serial killers in salad form. But newspapers weren't alone. Pamphlets, almanacs, word of mouth, and town gossip carried these spicy tomato rumors across regions faster than the printing press could reload. Local storytelling worked overtime to keep the tomato scary. Some folks swore they saw a neighbor develop mysterious symptoms after tomato consumption: convulsions, strange sweating, death-like sleep, and other totally unverified horrors. And since fact-checking was considered optional, and skepticism was just a Tuesday mood, these accounts got recycled until they felt like truth. What made it worse? Tomatoes were foreign. They hailed from the Americas, specifically Central and South America, where native peoples had been enjoying them for centuries without erupting into flames. But in the European mind, especially Victorian Britain and parts of the US, foreign was practically a synonym for untrustworthy and probably cursed. Imports weren't exotic, they were suspect. If your food didn't look like something your great-great-grandmother could boil into a grey pulp, it was immediately under investigation, and tomatoes looked guilty. Red, shiny, juicy, and dramatic. They were nature's scandal, sitting there like a ripe temptation sent from across the sea with absolutely no British modesty. Combine that with media stories hyping up their supposed connection to illness, madness, and moral collapse, and you had a recipe for Victorian food panic. In short, tomatoes were the clickbait of their time. Only instead of showing up as 13 fruits doctors hate, they showed up in half-baked murder mysteries and culinary horror stories. Writers treated tomato sightings like ghost stories. The Hendersons say they saw tomatoes being sold at the farmer's market. The vendor had foreign accent. Their maid is missing. Coincidence? Entire reputations could be called into question by proximity to a salad. Even recipes weren't safe. Tomato-based dishes, when they did appear, were often marked with caution. Tomato soup, if properly prepared, may not cause death. That's Victorian cookbook lingo for eat this at your own risk, Brenda. And then there were the quack medical pamphlets, eager to sell fear and miracle cures in equal measure. One week tomatoes were said to cause swelling of the brain, the next they were rumoured to cure gout, and the week after that they were accused of summoning unholy desires in the young and impressionable. The tomato was a medical mystery only because absolutely no one was bothering to actually study it. It was far more fun to speculate wildly and sell powdered anti-tomato tablets for 3 shillings a box. Let's not forget the class angle. The upper class, already suspicious of tomatoes for their association with commoners and immigrants, used these headlines to justify their snobbery. See? Tomatoes aren't simply vulgar, they're dangerous. They'd huff, reaching for their 16th bowl of gelatinous beef pudding. By the time the tomato was ready to mount a defense, the media had already tried and sentenced it. It would take decades, and quite a few brave mouths to undo the damage ink and rumour had done. Cue the dramatic music, because after centuries of being accused of everything short of sorcery and tax fraud, the tomato was about to pull off the most unexpected comeback in food history. Forget washed-up 80s rock bands doing reunion tours. This was the tomato redemption arc, and by the end of the 19th century, it was finally starting to hit the main stage. Let's rewind to the late 1800s. The tomato had spent the better part of the century hiding in the culinary shadows, whispered about, shunned by cookbooks, and occasionally used for medical potions and romantic disasters. But something was changing. Slowly, subtly, and often with extra garlic. The catalyst, immigration, and Italian food. While the British Empire was busy boiling things into oblivion, immigrants from Italy were arriving in the United States in growing numbers, bringing with them a secret weapon flavor. They didn't just tolerate the tomato, they celebrated it. They stewed it, stuffed it, sauced it, and slapped it onto dough in a move. So revolutionary it would later be known simply as pizza. These communities didn't see the tomato as a threat, they saw it as dinner. And the best part, they didn't die. In fact, they seemed to thrive. Italian immigrants were living long enough to open restaurants, pass down recipes, and feed suspicious neighbors, despite expecting heart palpitations, often walked away saying, "You know, that was actually pretty good." It was in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston that the tomato first began to creep out of exile. Working-class neighborhoods, filled with Italian, Greek, and other Mediterranean families, turned the tomato into a kitchen staple. Markets started selling them openly. Street vendors offered tomato-based sauces with pride. And the best part? The elite could smell it. Literally. The aroma of simmering tomato sauce wafted through tenement windows and across cobblestone streets, like an edible siren song. At first, the upper crust resisted. Of course they did. But resistance to good food is a tough sell when your own dinner still involves meat jelly and beige. Gradually, adventurous diners began to visit foreign restaurants, just to try it, just to see what all the fuss was about. Before long, spaghetti with tomato sauce wasn't just an immigrant dish. It was a full-blown trend, and it wasn't just Americans. Even in Victorian Britain, where food had the emotional range of a damp tea towel, tomatoes began to sneak onto the table in the late 19th century. Not in grand fashion, not yet in the royal kitchen, but they were there, peeking out from sauces, appearing cautiously in continental recipes, occasionally featured in the increasingly popular vegetable gardening guides. The public opinion had shifted. The tomato wasn't evil anymore. It was edgy. Tomato seeds became more widely available. Recipes started popping up in more mainstream cookbooks. Tomato gravy, stewed tomatoes, tomato toast. Yes, tomato toast. The Victorians accidentally invented avocado toast's sad older cousin. By the 1880s and 1890s, tomatoes had gone from devilish to dinner-worthy in polite society. What changed? Well, for one, the scientific community had finally caught up. People stopped blaming tomatoes for mysterious deaths and started understanding things like lead poisoning, food safety, and the fact that maybe the problem wasn't the tomato, but the 17th century plates soaked in heavy metals. Meanwhile, canning technology also played a huge role. By the 1860s and 70s, canned tomatoes became increasingly common. This extended shelf life and reduced the mystery surrounding the fruit. Instead of worrying about what to do with a big red orb in its natural, unpredictable state, you could now buy it in a tin neatly labelled and safety sealed. If anything screams "this won't kill you," it's a 19th century food can, with aggressively optimistic typography. Restaurants embraced the tomato. Home cooks began experimenting, and by the time Queen Victoria herself was nearing the end of her reign, the tomato had gone from suspicious to sophisticated. No longer a misunderstood outsider, it was now a well-travelled ingredient with a complex flavour profile and a surprisingly bright future, and the world noticed. The tomato wasn't just accepted, it was wanted. It found itself starring in salads, cozying up with pasta, and leading roles in sauces. From Paris cafes to New York diners, the tomato had officially gone global. Victorian medicine, where leeches were considered co-workers, mercury was a common prescription, and the word science often meant something I heard from my cousin's barber, who once studied Latin. In this bustling world of cure-alls, snake oils, and mystery tonics, the tomato, yes, the same fruit people once feared would assassinate them at lunch, somehow became a miracle cure, or, depending on whom you asked, an elixir of doom. Because what's better than a fruit that might either fix your body or end it? Let's dive in. Once tomatoes started shedding their reputation as dinner-table assassins and inching toward culinary acceptance, some imaginative Victorians did what they did best, turn food into medicine. Suddenly, the tomato wasn't just a garnish for brave souls, it was being marketed as a remedy for everything from bad digestion to mental instability to, I kid you not, syphilis. First, the digestion thing. In a time when people's diets consisted largely of boiled gristle, hard bread, and emotional repression, it's no wonder constipation was basically a national sport. Tomatoes, with their juicy texture, tart acidity and vitamin content, started looking pretty appealing to people suffering from what one might delicately call Victorian traffic jams. Early health enthusiasts argued that tomatoes could stimulate the liver, purify the blood, and regulate the humours, because when in doubt, blame the humours. Enter the tomato as gastrointestinal saviour. Doctors and quacks alike began recommending raw tomatoes in the morning, stewed tomatoes before bed, and tomato water as an all-purpose drink. Why suffer from stomach ailments, they argued, when you can fix your entire torso with something you previously accused of witchcraft? But wait, it gets weirder. By the mid to late 19th century, the tomato had made its way into the thriving and completely unregulated world of patent medicine. These were pre-FDA wonder potions sold from wagons, newspapers, and overly confident men with spectacular mustaches, and some of them leaned hard into tomato territory. Tomato pills and the very promising blood tomato purifier were sold as cure-alls that promised to heal your liver, purge your intestines, sharpen your eyesight, improve your mood, cure tuberculosis, and if you really stretched it, the help with venereal diseases, because nothing says reliable medical advice like slapping a tomato into a bottle and shouting syphilis, begone. Of course, none of these claims were tested, measured, or backed by even the loosest form of data, but that didn't stop customers from buying them by the crate. After all, this was the Victorian age, the same era where people treated coughs with opium and headaches with trepanning. If you were feeling off and someone offered you a tomato pill instead of a hole in your skull, you said thank you and swallowed it whole. One particularly infamous product was Dr. Bennett's tomato pill, first marketed in the 1830s. Bennett wasn't just any quack, he was a real doctor, albeit one who seemed less interested in medical journals and more interested in tomato-based brand expansion. He claimed his pills could treat diarrhea, dysentery, cholera, and indigestion. His advertising, glorious, full of phrases like nature's own remedy and trust in the tomato. What made it all more confusing was that some of it was accidentally sort of true. Tomatoes are rich in vitamin C, potassium, and lycopene, compounds that can help with inflammation and support heart health. But in Victorian England, no one knew this. These people weren't running chemical analysis. They were running vibes. Sometimes the tomato worked, sometimes it didn't, and sometimes it caused even more problems when it was mixed with other questionable ingredients, like alcohol, chalk dust, or straight-up arsenic, which, yes, was also used in medicine. Because why not? Perhaps the most bizarre irony of it all, the same newspapers and pamphlets that had once warned the public about tomatoes melting their stomach linings were now publishing ads promising tomato tonics that would restore their youth and cleanse their blood. The tomato had gone from public enemy to healing prophet in less than a generation, all without changing its chemical makeup. The only thing that changed was the story. And let's be honest, when it comes to Victorian medicine, it didn't take much. As long as your cure looked natural, sounded exotic, and was endorsed by someone wearing a monocle, you were good to go. The tomato, previously demonized as dangerous, had now earned a spot next to cod liver oil, mustard plasters, and electric belts as part of the elite club of treatments that might help you, or possibly explode your kidneys. Behind the hedges of prim Victorian estates, past the meticulously pruned rose bushes and judgmental topiary peacocks, a quiet revolution was taking root, a rebellion not fought with muskets or manifestos, but with mulch, watering cans, and a suspiciously vibrant red fruit. That's right. While Victorian society publicly side-eyed the tomato like it had just shown up to tea in leather pants, a secret army of gardeners was smuggling it into the soil like it was contraband. You see, in a time when the tomato was still seen as a moral and culinary risk, too foreign, too flashy, too red, growing one wasn't just a gardening choice, it was a statement, and in some circles, a scandal, especially in upper-class households where taste, both literal and social, was tightly policed. To cultivate tomatoes in your garden was to flirt with botanical controversy. Gardeners, particularly those employed by wealthier families, often found themselves caught between their employers' expectations for ornamental perfection and their own curiosity about that strange little fruit that people said might kill you, or worse, make you look French. So what did they do? Well, like any good Victorian drama, they went full secret agent. Tomatoes were often grown out of sight, hidden behind greenhouse doors, downwind from the begonias, or tucked into corners of the kitchen garden, where the lady of the house wouldn't dare to tread for fear of encountering actual vegetables. Some even built makeshift cloches or glass frames to disguise them. Tiny tomato bunkers that let the plants thrive while dodging judgmental glances from nearby geraniums. And it wasn't just about appearances. If word got out that you were growing tomatoes, you risked your reputation as a respectable gardener. You might be accused of following fads, of embracing untested foreign horticulture, or worst of all, of having opinions. In an era when a crooked trellis could lead to passive-aggressive remarks at dinner, growing tomatoes was a genuine act of rebellion. These tomato-tending rebels didn't just grow them, they experimented. Early Victorian tomato cultivars were often seen as unreliable or misshapen. Some gardeners tried crossbreeding for better colour, improved taste, or resistance to the dreaded blight. Many failed, some succeeded. A few even entered their hidden tomatoes into local fairs under fake names or vague categories, like miscellaneous fruit, hoping to show off their success without outing themselves as tomato sympathizers. But slowly, very slowly, the tide began to turn. By the 1870s and 1880s, tomatoes started popping up in more gardening manuals. Not center stage, mind you. This was still a society that treated enthusiasm with suspicion, but in footnotes, sidebars, and cautiously optimistic bullet points. Publications like the Gardener's Chronicle would publish lines like tomatoes, if properly grown and not overly indulged, may produce fruit of acceptable character, though some continue to find the flavor assertive. AKA, they're delicious, but we're scared to admit it out loud. And the working class was way ahead of the game. In more modest homes with backyard plots or allotment gardens, tomatoes were grown more openly, though often still with a bit of local suspicion. A neighbor might raise an eyebrow and ask, "You sure that's safe to eat?" But with each passing season, as no one died and people started actually enjoying their salads, tomatoes became a less controversial guest at the table. By the turn of the 20th century, tomato gardening was no longer seen as subversive. It was seen as smart. Tomatoes were hardy, versatile, and increasingly popular in both British and American recipes. Seed catalogues began featuring whole sections on tomato varieties, from trophy to perfection to the deeply humble-sounding Livingston's favourite. Suddenly, what had once been a dangerous fruit of the devil was now the star of the summer garden. And what about the gardeners who'd grown them in secret all those years? They got the last laugh. The same households that had once scoffed at their tomato tinkering were now requesting them for sauces, soups, and showy salads. The punk rockers of the greenhouse had gone mainstream, but they'd always known what was up. Because really, what's more rebellious than growing something bright, bold, and forbidden in the middle of a beige world that told you not to? You know you've made it as a fruit when people are still terrified to eat you, but they'll absolutely wear you, decorate with you, and sew you into their personal brand. Welcome to the strange world of Victorian tomato fashion and symbolism, where food anxiety met aesthetic obsession, and the tomato somehow went from dangerous death fruit to adorable household accessory. Let's start with one of the weirdest facts hiding in plain sight in your grandma's sewing box. The tomato-shaped pincushion. That's right, those cute little red cushions with a green leafy top, often accompanied by a tiny attached strawberry, which was filled with emery powder to clean needles, weren't just a random crafty invention. They were a symbol of domesticity, luck, and stylish practicality. And they date back to, you guessed it, the Victorian era. At a time when tomatoes were still viewed with deep suspicion on the dinner plate, someone, almost certainly a woman wielding both a needle and a sense of humour, decided that the tomato made the perfect shape for a household tool. Round, firm, brightly coloured, and definitely not for eating. It was the perfect metaphor for the Victorian relationship with tomatoes. Admire it, use it, reference it, but don't you dare chew it. The tomato pincushion was more than a quirky fashion statement. It was part of a larger Victorian tradition of symbolic sewing tools. According to folklore, placing a tomato on the mantelpiece of a new home was supposed to bring prosperity and ward off evil spirits. In places and times when real tomatoes were scarce or rotting, women made stuffed fabric versions as substitutes. These symbolic tomatoes quietly became part of household decor, especially for the domestic goddess class who ruled the parlour like benevolent dictators with embroidery hoops. But tomatoes didn't just stop at sewing accessories. Oh no, The Victorians, ever fans of finding meaning in literally everything, used tomatoes in art, fashion, and metaphor, where they became loaded with juicy double meanings. In the language of Victorian symbolism, tomatoes, like their equally misunderstood cousin the apple, became shorthand for temptation, sensuality, and femininity. Their red hue, full shape, and exotic background made them the perfect muse for artists looking to spice up a still life painting or sneak a little sensuality into their work without scandalizing the neighbors. A woman holding a tomato in an 1870s painting wasn't just holding lunch. She was holding danger, desire, and possibly a metaphor for sinful urges. You see, red was the color of passion, of moral wavering, of lips slightly parted in rebellion, and a tomato. A tomato was soft, round, fertile-looking, and possibly toxic. Basically the perfect Victorian metaphor for women, especially the kind society liked to admire in public and judge in private. In fact, fashion magazines of the time began including subtle tomato motifs in things like embroidery patterns, accessory design, and even jewelry. That's right. The fruit they wouldn't serve at dinner was making cameos on brooches and hatpins. It's as if Victorian society collectively decided, we may not eat tomatoes, but we will absolutely flirt with them. Of course, this symbolism wasn't without contradiction. On one hand, the tomato represented sensual danger, a red flag in fruit form. On the other hand, it became associated with fertility and domestic prosperity, especially as its medicinal and culinary reputation began to shift in the late 19th century. The tomato was the ultimate paradox, feared in the kitchen, fetishized in the parlor. This double identity found its way into the burgeoning world of domestic advice manuals. Some authors cautiously praised tomatoes for their supposed health benefits and feminine symbolism. Others warned that too much tomato consumption or even association might encourage moral laxity. Imagine reading that your needle cushion might be responsible for moral decline. Only the Victorians could create such drama from such a salad item. Even children's books and illustrations played with tomato imagery. Stories about magical gardens occasionally featured talking tomato plants, usually wise, sometimes sassy, and always suspiciously knowledgeable about the consequences of temptation. These weren't bedtime tales about fruit. These were Victorian parables in disguise, served with a side of produce-themed psychology. And let's not forget the upper-class dinnerware sets that began including tomato-inspired patterns by the turn of the century. Suddenly, tomatoes were good enough to decorate your china, but only in painted form, of course. You wouldn't actually eat them. Heavens, no, that would be gauche. This all begs the question, were Victorians obsessed with tomatoes, or just deeply confused by them? Probably both. Victorian ladies feared tomatoes on their plate, but loved them on their sewing kit. Peak aesthetic confusion. Ah, the tomato. Once the edible equivalent of a loaded pistol at the dinner table, now the undisputed king of condiments, sauces, and late-night pizza orders. The fruit that once inspired hushed whispers, botanic suspicion, and sewing accessories shaped in its image, has completed its century-spanning redemption arc. In a plot twist worthy of Shakespeare if he'd ever written about salads, the tomato has gone from lethal love apple to fridge MVP. Let's start with the obvious. Today, tomatoes are everywhere. They're in your pasta sauce, your taco salsa, your ketchup, your Bloody Mary, your overpriced artisanal bruschetta. They're sliced on sandwiches, pureed into soups, and dried and stuffed into things you don't even remember ordering. The average household treats tomatoes like culinary duct tape, good for everything, and applied with reckless joy. And that's the irony, isn't it? The very fruit Victorians feared might leach lead from their pewter plates and poison their dainty livers now sits front and center in pantries around the world. A standard grocery store might stock no fewer than 10 tomato-based products. Canned, diced, stewed, sun-dried, roasted, pureed, and more. It's not even a question of if you eat tomatoes anymore. It's a matter of how many forms you'll ingest before noon. Let's talk about the fast food industry, a modern arena where tomatoes absolutely reign. You can't swing a drive-through menu without hitting a tomato-based item. Ketchup alone has become a global ambassador for the fruit, drizzled on fries, burgers, hot dogs, and occasionally used by toddlers as finger paint. In fact, in some countries, it's estimated that over 97% of households keep ketchup in the kitchen. That's more consistent than soap. Imagine dragging a time-traveling Victorian into a McDonald's. their brain would melt. You mean people willingly squirt the red fruit of doom onto food, eat it with greasy sticks, and call it a happy meal? Yes, Reginald, we sure do, and we love it. It's more than just fast food though. Pizza, once an obscure peasant dish from southern Italy, has risen to become one of the world's most beloved meals. And it wouldn't exist without that glorious layer of tomato sauce holding everything together like a red, flavorful glue. The tomato went from dangerous to essential, and somehow, society has collectively agreed never to look back. The tomato's modern rise also tells us something hilarious about human nature. We're fantastic at being wrong in large organized groups. For decades, even centuries, people genuinely believed tomatoes were toxic, sinful, or somehow both. There were sermons, editorials, and polite tea-time discussions warning against their consumption. And now, we celebrate them with entire festivals. Enter La Tomatina in Buñol, Spain, an annual event where thousands of people throw tomatoes at each other in what is essentially a sanctioned produce riot. There's no clearer sign that a food has made peace with humanity than when we begin to weaponize it recreationally. And let's not forget science's full circle moment. Today, nutritionists praise tomatoes as a superfood rich in antioxidants like lycopene, which helps fight cancer, reduce inflammation, and possibly prevent heart disease. This same fruit that Victorians once side-eyed like it owed them money is now being hailed as a miracle of cardiovascular wellness. Tomatoes have also achieved something most foods never do. They're culturally flexible, from Italian marinara to Indian chutneys, Mexican salsas to American barbecue sauce. The tomato has managed to blend seamlessly into global cuisines without losing its core identity. It adapts, evolves, and always manages to taste like it belongs, unlike, say, Jell-O salads or boiled eels, which still haunt dinner tables to this day. So what do we take away from all this? First, never trust the judgment of a society that thought arsenic made for a good skincare routine but had trust issues with tomatoes. Second, food history is less about logic and more about storytelling. The reason tomatoes were feared wasn't because of their chemical makeup. It was because of the myths, rumors, and unchecked assumptions that wrapped around them like vines. And finally, it proves that sometimes being misunderstood just means you're ahead of your time, especially if you're juicy, red, and wildly misinterpreted. The tomato, once cursed and condemned, now rests comfortably in salad bowls, sauce jars, and yes, even on French fries, like a crown jewel on the throne of snack food. It's the underdog story of the culinary world, complete with drama, suspicion, redemption, and a ketchup packet for emotional closure. Victorians thought tomatoes were deadly. Now we put them on fries and call it ketchup. Plot twist of the century. Let's talk about the evolution of beauty standards. The year is 25,000 BCE. You don't have Wi-Fi, moisturizer, or any clue what a calorie is. But you do have a mammoth problem. Literally. You just helped chase one for 3 hours with a pointy stick, and now you're expected to look hot at the fire circle. Welcome to prehistoric beauty culture, where your contour palette is made of mud, your perfume smells like burning mammoth fat, and your most attractive quality is hasn't died yet. Let's set the stage. Our early Homo sapiens ancestors didn't have mirrors, but they had eyes, and those eyes liked what they saw, or more accurately, they liked what helped them survive. Beauty, at its core, was about practicality. Healthy skin, strong limbs, good teeth, and the ability to not keel over mid-foraging session. Think of it less as vanity, more as an early form of quality control. Now, it might surprise you to learn that even in these raw, unwashed times, there's evidence that people were trying to enhance their appearance. Archaeologists have found body paint made from ochre, a natural red or yellow pigment made from clay and iron oxide. It was used on everything: faces, torsos, tools, maybe even pets. It could have been ceremonial, or maybe it was just the first version of blush, but make it primal. Either way, prehistoric people weren't above a little pigment power. If you're wondering what the world's first highlighter was, it was animal fat. Yep, slather some bear grease on your cheeks, and you've got a dewy glow that says, "I haven't frozen to death today." Some anthropologists even argue that body shimmer was a legit beauty move. A glistening body may have signaled health, strength, and enough hunting skill to have leftover fat to rub on yourself. In a world where calories were currency, glowing wasn't just cute, it was rich. Jewelry, too, was a thing. Not the kind you'd find at a Paris runway, but still impressive in its own way. Shells, bones, feathers, and animal teeth were fashioned into necklaces and bracelets. Why? Possibly status, possibly spiritual, but also possibly because shiny things make you look cool. And apparently, that instinct is older than fire pits. If you were adorned in teeth and feathers, you weren't just showing off. You were saying, look at all the stuff I've outlived. And what about symmetry? Here's where things get biologically spicy. Across cultures and millennia, humans have gravitated towards symmetrical faces and bodies. In caveman times, this wasn't about aesthetics. It was about survival. A symmetrical face often meant strong genes, no diseases, and that your parents didn't accidentally drop you on your head. If your eyes were even and your jaw wasn't lopsided, congratulations, you were prehistoric prom royalty. And let's talk about hips. In today's world, childbearing hips might be an outdated phrase, but back then, that was like having a verified badge on your fertility app. Broad hips suggested easier childbirth, and therefore higher reproductive success, which, in caveman dating terms, was the gold standard. Swipe right for pelvis width. Hair care was also a form of status signaling. Sure, no one was doing updos or French braids, but keeping your hair relatively clean, braided or ornamented, could set you apart. You might have used river clay to slick it down, or decorated it with leaves or beads. Think of it as early fashion meets plant-based headwear. So how did a cave woman know if she was hot? Simple. She was alive, didn't have lice or at least too many, and could outrun a saber-toothed cat. Standards were different. You didn't need a waist trainer. You just needed to be able to throw a rock with enough force to defend your dinner. Even scent had its prehistoric moment. Without soap, perfume, or Febreze, humans relied on smoke, not just for warmth and cooking, but possibly to mask body odor. Sitting by the fire may have doubled as an ancient deodorant strategy. If you smelled like burnt mammoth and pinewood, that was just earthy musk before it became a cologne. Of course, all this beauty was deeply intertwined with rituals, beliefs, and group identity. Beauty wasn't just about looking good. It was about blending in or standing out depending on what your group valued. Were you wearing red ochre because it was hot, or because the shaman said it kept away evil spirits? Maybe both, just like today's skincare rituals. It was a mix of hope, habit, and some very questionable science. To sum it up, prehistoric beauty was gritty, greasy, and full of survival energy. You didn't need a glow-up, you needed a don't die down, and yet, the earliest humans still found time to decorate themselves, paint their bodies, and choose mates based on who had the healthiest looking everything. The good news, you're still alive. The bad news, so are the lice. If beauty is pain, then ancient Egypt was the original catwalk of suffering and style. This was a society that practically invented the idea of looking good while slowly poisoning yourself. From heavily lined eyes to melting perfume on your scalp. Egyptian beauty wasn't just about aesthetics. It was divine, deadly, and scented like frankincense with a side of regret. Let's start with the eyes, because kohl eyeliner wasn't just a look. It was a national identity. Egyptians lined their eyes so heavily, it looked like they were preparing for a smoky eye competition with the gods themselves. The dark lines, extending dramatically past the outer corners, weren't just for flair. Kohl was believed to ward off evil spirits, reduce sun glare, ancient UV protection, and repel flies. That's right, your dramatic winged eyeliner could double as mosquito repellent. Take that, Sephora. The problem? It often contained lead-based compounds, which gave it that rich black hue and the added bonus of, well, mild to severe neurotoxicity. But in the name of protection, prestige, and pest control, a little brain damage was just the price of beauty. Cleopatra didn't rise to icon status without risking a few neurons. Now, let's talk about perfume cones, one of the most absurdly fabulous inventions in beauty history. Imagine attending a formal dinner, and instead of putting on perfume before arriving, you stick a cone of scented animal fat on your head and let it slowly melt down your scalp as the evening wears on. Sounds disgusting? It was the pinnacle of high society elegance. These cones released waves of myrrh and lotus as they liquefied in the Egyptian heat. Your hair, slicked, your scent, unstoppable, your head, slightly greasy. And while we're on the subject of heads, let's address wigs, because ancient Egypt had a wig game that would humble any Hollywood stylist. Hair was high maintenance and the Nile wasn't exactly pumping out shampoo, so instead, elite Egyptians shaved their heads. Lice were not fashion forward, and wore elaborately crafted wigs made of human hair, sheep's wool, and even palm fibers. These weren't just throw-on affairs. They were styled, perfumed, and sometimes topped with gold accessories or even tiny decorative statues. Your head wasn't just part of your outfit. It was the outfit. But beauty in Egypt wasn't just for women. Men wore makeup, wigs, and perfume too. Pharaohs had cosmetic stashes that would rival modern-day influencers. To be powerful was to be polished, and personal grooming was a political statement. If your eyeliner wasn't sharp, how could your leadership be? Skincare, of course, was a vital part of this glam routine. And by skincare, we mean concoctions so creative, they'd get you banned from a modern salon. One favorite facial treatment? Crocodile dung mixed with sour milk. Supposedly, great for clearing the skin, though likely better at clearing the room. Still, this early exfoliation blend had lactic acid from the milk and minerals from, well, the poop. So maybe they were onto something horrifyingly effective. If you wanted soft skin, you didn't reach for lotion. You reached for castor oil, animal fat, or beeswax, sometimes mixed with honey. It was sticky, it was messy, but it beat sunburn and probably helped seal in moisture while also attracting a swarm of bees. Bonus: honey was antibacterial, so it helped with wounds and skin irritations. Basically, the ancient Egyptian glow came from stuff you'd never willingly smear on your face today, unless TikTok told you to. Lips and cheeks, blushed with red ochre powder, mixed with fat for that creamy, long-lasting finish. Think of it as the ancient version of longwear lipstick. The look was bold, confident, and probably a bit gritty. And again, both men and women rocked the rouge. Ancient Egypt didn't believe in subtle. They believed in serving looks for the afterlife. Speaking of the afterlife, beauty didn't stop at death. Egyptians were buried with their makeup, their wigs, their perfumes. The idea was that if you were going to meet Osiris, god of the dead, you better be camera ready. Tombs have been found with neatly arranged cosmetic cases, complete with mirrors, tweezers, and makeup spoons carved from ivory. Some people took better vanity sets to the underworld than most of us have on Earth. And in one of the most absurd but very real expressions of beauty loyalty, if your beloved cat died, and you were wealthy enough, you shaved your eyebrows in mourning. Not your head, not a black veil, your eyebrows. Ancient Egyptians loved their cats more than most people love their spouses. This was their version of sad face makeup. And honestly, it might come back into fashion with the right influencer. In Egypt, beauty wasn't shallow. It was sacred. It was protection, performance, and religion all rolled into one. Cosmetics were offerings to the gods, indicators of status, and methods of literal self-preservation. You weren't just painting your face, you were telling the world, and possibly the afterlife, I am important, protected, and look amazing in coal. They didn't have Botox, but they did have crocodile dung facials. And in their defense, at least that stuff was organic. If ancient Egypt was the land of eyeliner and elegance, then classical Greece and Rome were the lands of chiseled cheekbones, olive oil, everything, and public bath gossip sessions. Beauty was no longer just a personal ritual. It became a full-time philosophical and physical obsession. And in a world where your status could rise and fall on the quality of your skin tone or the boldness of your unibrow, things got shiny and gritty, sometimes literally gritty. Let's start with the Greeks, who took one look at the human body and said, "This is art." Sculptors carved six-packs into marble like they were frosting cakes. But it wasn't all about abs. Facial symmetry was the Greek gold standard. If your eyes, ears, and nose lined up perfectly, you weren't just attractive, you were divinely aligned. The gods themselves, they believed, had symmetrical features. So yes, your chances at romance or respect could be crushed by one slightly crooked nostril. But the ancient Greeks weren't just staring at statues, they were busy maintaining their own earthly forms. One of the most prized features, pale skin. A tan suggested you worked outside, probably breaking rocks or farming barley. Not exactly the dream lifestyle, but pale, that meant you were rich enough to never touch the sun. It also meant you had time to sit indoors, write long poems about tragic heroes, and possibly complain about democracy. To maintain that fashionable pallor, Greek women would coat their skin with white lead. Yes, lead. Again. It was like ancient people were in a committed relationship with poisonous cosmetics. The result was ghostly, flawless skin that screamed, "I definitely don't till fields for a living." This look was paired with light rouge for cheeks and a dab of red ochre on the lips, just to prove you had blood circulation under all that chalk. But let's not forget the unibrow, a true Greek power move. In today's beauty world, the unibrow is treated like a follicular accident, but in classical Greece, it was a symbol of intelligence and sexual allure. Women who weren't naturally blessed would fill the gap in with soot, charcoal, or even goat hair glued on for extra drama. A full brow meant a full brain, or at least full commitment to the trend. Now let's glide over to Rome, where everything Greek was either copied, conquered, or covered in marble. Roman beauty was a little less about spiritual ideals, and a lot more about showing off wealth, hygiene, and your new favorite imported face scrub. And yes, about that scrub, Romans exfoliated using fine sand or ground pumice stones. Imagine taking a relaxing bath and then giving your face a light sanding, like you're a coffee table, getting prepped for varnish. It wasn't exactly gentle, but it left your skin smooth, or at least too numb to complain. This kind of gritty exfoliation was often done in the public baths, where everyone from senators to slaves gathered to soak, gossip, and scrape off dead skin together. Communal skincare. Roman spa culture was elite. These weren't just hot tubs. They were architectural masterpieces with steam rooms, cold plunges, oil massages, and more body scraping than a haunted wax museum. After bathing, Romans slathered themselves in olive oil, both for moisturizing and to prove they could afford food they weren't going to eat. Olive oil wasn't just a pantry staple, it was a skincare flex. Hair removal was another key part of the beauty game. Romans didn't believe in body hair. If you were hairy, you were uncivilized, possibly barbaric, and definitely not sexy. Tweezer-like tools called volsella were used to pluck individual hairs, often by a servant while you lay there dramatically. Want a wax? Try resin, pitch, or even burnt walnut shells. Smooth legs were so essential that even male athletes and senators waxed. Your masculinity wasn't questioned, it was polished. For makeup, Roman women went heavy on the blush. The eyeliner, yes, still, and the lipstick, sometimes made from crushed red ochre, wine dregs, or iron oxide. They also had powders made from chalk, starch, or even crocodile dung. But hey, we said no repetition. So let's focus on their favorite saffron. This bright yellow spice wasn't just for spicing stews, it was used as a luxury highlighter, glowing like a Roman torch, saffron it up. But no Roman look was complete without hair drama. Hairstyles were the status symbol of the day. Upper-class women had elaborate updos, often with braids, curls, and accessories that could double as ship rigging. Wigs made from German slave hair were prized for their blonde color. Yes, Romans conquered Gaul and took their hair home as souvenirs. If that doesn't scream luxury, nothing does. And let's not forget the beauty advice books. The Roman world had its own version of beauty influences, except they published scrolls instead of TikToks. One famous beauty writer, Ovid, literally penned skincare tips alongside love poetry. Imagine Shakespeare writing a sonnet and then pausing to recommend goat milk for glowing skin. In the end, classical beauty was about more than just looking good. It was about being seen as intelligent, rich, and Roman enough to exfoliate with volcanic rock. Every eyebrow, oil bath, and lead-painted cheek was a declaration. I am a civilized citizen. And also, yes, I sparkle slightly, because nothing says I'm desirable like rubbing your face with gravel. If you're looking for beauty standards that feel like a bizarre Renaissance fair fever dream, welcome to medieval Europe, where your face was considered hotter the more of it you had above the eyebrows. This was a time when people bathed about as often as they saw a dentist read. Not often, perfume masked more than just insecurity, and pale skin was all the rage, as long as you didn't look too alive. Let's start with the forehead, the holy grail of medieval fashion. Today, bangs are trendy. In the Middle Ages, a forehead the size of a billboard was the ultimate status symbol. A high, round forehead meant nobility, elegance, and presumably extra room for divine thoughts. To achieve this look, women literally plucked their hairlines back, sometimes several inches, to give their heads a glorious, bald-forward aesthetic. They didn't stop at the scalp either. Eyebrows were often plucked into oblivion, or removed entirely, to further enhance that massive expanse of face real estate. The result? An eerily blank upper face that screamed, "I read poetry and own land." Think Mona Lisa, but with less expression and more tweezers. And speaking of screaming, your skin had to look like you'd never seen sunlight, happiness, or a nutrient. Pale was powerful. It meant you didn't labor outside like the unfortunate souls who actually kept society functioning. Instead, you lounged around drafty stone castles in flowing gowns, eating bread crusts and talking about saints. If you naturally had darker or more sun-kissed skin, time to get to work. Literally, because you were probably a peasant. To achieve this fashionable pallor, medieval women turned to all kinds of dangerous and absurd substances. Lead-based powders, chalk dust, and vinegar-based concoctions were applied to the face until you looked like a porcelain ghost with anxiety. One popular trick was to bleed yourself just a little, because what's a bit of anemia if it means your cheekbones pop? And yes, this was all done in the name of appearing fragile, ethereal, and preferably one draft away from collapsing. Medieval society didn't want you looking healthy. They wanted you to look tragically beautiful, like a damsel in distress, with excellent bone structure. Now let's talk about bathing, or rather the lack thereof. Despite what you've heard, not everyone in the Middle Ages was allergic to water, but regular bathing certainly wasn't common among the upper classes, not because they didn't want to be clean, but because of a widespread belief that baths could open your pores and let in disease. That's right. Taking a bath was considered a health risk. The filth on your skin was seen as a protective layer, like medieval SPF. So instead of washing, many nobles turned to perfumes and scented waters, often made from rose petals, herbs, and spices. These weren't just pleasant smells. They were status symbols, worn on clothing, rubbed into hair, or soaked into gloves. If you smelled like lavender and didn't look like you'd broken a sweat since the plague started, congratulations, you were society's idea of a total catch. Now, despite the fear of baths, there were still public bathhouses operating in some towns, but these quickly became associated with sin, scandal, and syphilis. By the 14th century, many bathhouses were shut down for being a little too splashy, so the idea of personal hygiene became tangled up in morality, and before you knew it, people were scrubbing their souls instead of their armpits. Hair, too, played a role in medieval beauty, but only if it wasn't actually seen. Modesty was key. Married women were expected to cover their hair completely, with veils, hoods, or elaborate headdresses that looked like the inspiration for every future Disney villain. If you showed your hair in public, it wasn't just risque, it was practically criminal. And yet, the irony is that women still styled their hair elaborately underneath all those layers, often braiding it with ribbons or threading it with beads, because even if no one saw it, you knew. As for makeup, the ideal was to look like you weren't wearing any, even though you totally were. Rouge was applied sparingly to the cheeks and lips, often using crushed flowers or berries. Too much, though, and you were labelled vain or worse, a witch, and no one wants their blush to lead to a spontaneous heresy trial. Teeth? Not part of the beauty standard. Dental care was more about survival than aesthetics, and smiling wide wasn't exactly a thing. If anything, a serene, closed-mouth look was the goal, possibly because smiling revealed what you didn't want people to see. Medieval dentistry, or the lack thereof. And finally, no beauty guide of the 1300s would be complete without a nod to courtly love, that confusing romantic system where knights wrote poems to women they couldn't touch, and everyone was expected to look beautiful while slowly dying of unrequited affection. A pale, delicate, forehead-forward woman was the ultimate muse, unattainable, mysterious, and ideally, not smelling like she lived above a fish market. So to recap, the ultimate medieval beauty was pale, bald at the top, unscented by sweat but heavily perfumed, possibly diseased, and spiritually radiant. It was a look that said, "I own land, fear soap, and haven't smiled since the Black Death." The Renaissance. A glorious rebirth of art, science, culture, and some deeply alarming beauty practices. It was a time when Europe rediscovered ancient ideals, funded outrageous fashion with merchant gold, and decided that the ideal woman should look like she's been airbrushed by a slightly intoxicated angel. Welcome to the world of powdered faces, chemically enhanced eyeballs, and hips that didn't lie. They just sat in velvet and stared off into the distance. Let's begin with the face, which during this era wasn't just a canvas, It was the canvas. Renaissance women didn't want sun-kissed cheeks or natural radiance. They wanted to look like statues. Specifically, the statues being carved by guys named Michelangelo, who really loved a pale lady. To achieve that coveted marble-like complexion, women turned to the good old classic lead-based white paint. Yes, again with the lead. But Renaissance ladies took it up a notch, applying a thick layer of ceruse, a foundation made by mixing vinegar with white lead. The result? Flawless, luminous skin that practically glowed under candlelight, and also flaked off, caused hair loss, and gradually poisoned you from the outside in. But hey, beauty is sacrifice, right? This wasn't just about following a trend, it was about signaling class. Pale skin meant you didn't work outdoors, which meant you had money, which meant you were basically royalty. Tans were for peasants, sailors, and people who couldn't afford to spend 6 hours blending toxic substances onto their cheeks. And the beauty didn't stop at the skin. Let's talk about the eyes, which were expected to be large, dewy, and full of sorrow. The Renaissance ideal was a woman who looked like she'd just heard a tragic poem and couldn't quite see where it went. To help achieve this misty, wide-eyed gaze, women used belladonna eye drops, made from the deadly nightshade plant. These drops would dilate the pupils, creating that signature, "I'm too delicate to see anything" look that was all the rage. The name belladonna literally means beautiful woman in Italian. But let's be clear, these drops weren't just dangerous, they were comically dangerous. Side effects included blurred vision, light sensitivity, hallucinations, and sometimes permanent blindness. But if you could still walk a straight line and blink attractively, you were Renaissance ready. And oh, the hair drama. In Renaissance Italy, blonde was the ideal. Not natural blonde because that was rare, but chemically engineered, sun-fried, and herb-brewed blonde. Women would sit for hours with mixtures of saffron, alum, and sulfur on their hair, then bake under the sun in wide-brimmed, face-covering hats that exposed only their locks. The goal was to achieve a golden halo of curls that screamed, "I read Petrarch and smell faintly of soup." Eyebrows, lightened or thinned until nearly invisible. Lips, painted red with a mixture of crushed flowers or red wine sediment. Teeth, still very much ignored. As long as your mouth was closed and your cheekbones were sharp, no one cared if your dental hygiene could make a plague doctor cry. And let's now discuss bodies, because the Renaissance was one of the rare historical periods where voluptuousness was in. Thank the goddess Venus, or rather Botticelli's version of her. Plumpness signified health, fertility, and access to bread, which was pretty much the trifecta of desirability. If you had soft arms, full thighs, and a stomach that said, "I know how to enjoy a cheese wheel," you were winning. This appreciation for curves was immortalized in painting after painting, where women reclined on cushions looking mildly surprised, possibly because they had no idea how they'd gotten there. Their poses often accentuated their roundness, soft skin, and overall vibe of, "I just woke up like this in a palace." But the Renaissance wasn't all just powdered cheeks and chubby goddesses. It was also the golden age of beauty advice literature. Texts like The Secrets of Women, Not Subtle and Trotula offered tips on everything from removing unwanted facial hair to bleaching freckles with vinegar-soaked bread. There were even recipes for homemade perfumes using ambergris, a waxy substance found in whale intestines that smelled oddly pleasant. Once you got past the fact that it came from whale intestines, hygiene was making a comeback too. Unlike in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance saw the return of bathing, at least among the wealthy. Public bathhouses were reopening, and private washrooms became a must-have accessory for the elite. So yes, for the first time in a while, rich people actually started to smell vaguely human again. But here's the kicker. All this effort wasn't just about looking good. Renaissance beauty was deeply tied to morality, virtue, and family honor. A beautiful woman reflected well on her husband and her household. Looking tragic but elegant was practically a public service. And so, every brush of ceruse, every eye-blinding drop of belladonna was a declaration. I am noble, refined, and fully committed to dying fabulous. Because nothing says desirable like toxic face paint and blurry vision. If there's one era that fully committed to extra, it was the Georgian era. Welcome to 18th century Europe, where people didn't just want to look beautiful, they wanted to look like porcelain dolls brought to life by powdered sugar, vermilion, and a mild sense of personal decay. If your hair could knock over a chandelier, and your cheeks looked like you were permanently embarrassed by your own wealth, you were doing it right. Let's start with the hair, because Georgian fashion didn't just raise eyebrows, it raised entire hairlines. Powdered wigs became the defining look of the century, and not just small, sensible ones. We're talking gravity-defying monuments of hair, sometimes 3 feet tall, laced with lace, silk, pearls, and in at least one documented case, a tiny bird cage with live birds inside. That's right, nothing says good evening like your head chirping softly at the dinner table. These wigs weren't just for show, they were status symbols. The taller and more elaborate your wig, the more clearly you declared, I have money, servants, and no need to walk near doorways without ducking. Women would spend hours getting their wigs styled and powdered with rice flour or starch, sometimes tinted with lavender, blue or pink to match their gowns or their mood. And yes, men wore wigs too, though theirs were more conservative unless they were politicians, in which case anything went. But under all that wig action, often no real hair at all. Many people shaved their heads to accommodate these towering constructions and to help fight off lice infestations, because nothing ruins an aristocratic soiree faster than someone scratching like a fiddle player mid-fugue. Now onto the face, where Georgian beauty took a sharp turn into the absurdly theatrical. Pale skin was still in, because some traditions die hard, but the real emphasis was on blush, and not just a polite dab. Georgian rouge was clowncore chic. Big, bold circles of red, slapped dramatically onto the cheeks. This rouge wasn't made from your friendly neighborhood berry blend either. The good stuff came from cochineal beetles, crushed into a deep crimson powder, and mixed with grease or vinegar. Yes, your cheeks looked like you just sprinted a mile in heels, but you were also wearing insect paste with a side of subtle toxicity. But in fairness, it did pop beautifully under candlelight. And then there were the beauty patches. These were tiny pieces of velvet or silk, shaped into hearts, stars, or crescent moons, and glued to the face. While they started off as a way to cover smallpox scars or blemishes, they quickly turned into a full-blown fashion statement. The placement of your patch could even send a message. One near the mouth meant you were flirtatious, on the right cheek meant you were married, and on the left cheek meant you were single, and possibly ready to gossip. But perhaps the most tragically fabulous part of the Georgian look, teeth, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Sugar had become wildly fashionable, imported from the colonies, and dumped into everything from tea to desserts to medicinal tonics. Unfortunately, dentistry was still in its let's guess and scream phase. As a result, tooth decay ran rampant among the elite. Instead of cutting back on sugar, perish the thought, many people opted for the next best thing, fake teeth or tooth patches. These weren't full dentures yet, just bits of ivory or porcelain used to hide the gaping spots where your actual teeth had thrown in the towel. If that didn't work, some just smeared dark wax over the gaps, hoping the candlelit ambience would disguise the dental situation. Spoiler, it often didn't. And let's not forget the perfume, not because it was subtle, but because it was everywhere. People didn't just dab perfume on their wrists, they bathed in it, poured it onto clothes, soaked their wigs in it, and even kept scented handkerchiefs to waft gently under their noses, in case someone nearby smelled mortal. Hygiene was improving ever so slightly, but perfume was still doing the heavy lifting. Your goal wasn't just to smell good, it was to smell expensive. The clothing matched the faces and wigs, elaborate, embroidered, corseted, and layered. You didn't just wear a dress, you wore an event. Women could barely move without help. Men wore heels, ruffled collars, and so much satin they shimmered like chandeliers. Looking good meant being visible from space, and the whole aesthetic, designed to be theatrical, performative, and so over the top it circled back to iconic. Georgian beauty wasn't about subtle charm, it was about announcing your presence, whether by the swish of a brocade sleeve or the creak of your powdered beehive scraping the ceiling. So yes, they were glamorous, powdered, perfumed, rouged, patched, and wigged to the heavens, but also slowly dying of fashion, thanks to toxic makeup, rotting teeth, and wigs so heavy, they probably caused long-term neck damage. But darling, if you didn't suffer, were you even fabulous? If Georgian beauty was all about powdered drama and decadent excess, the Victorian era decided to do a complete 180 with a tightly cinched waist and a politely repressed smile. Welcome to the 19th century, where women were expected to be modest, delicate, morally upright, and also somehow pull off the look of a corseted swan who had never digested a full meal. This was an age where fainting was fashionable, breathing was optional, and arsenic was sold at the pharmacy with a label that basically read, "Glows now, dies later." Let's begin with the ideal look. Pale, soft, gentle, and preferably about one good swoon away from collapsing on a chaise lounge. The Victorian beauty standard was all about appearing pure, innocent, and vaguely unwell. If you looked like you'd just read a tragic poem in the rain and hadn't fully recovered, you were killing it, figuratively, and, in some cases, literally. One of the most horrifying beauty products of the time, arsenic wafers. That's right, Victorian women swallowed actual poison to lighten their skin, reduce blemishes, and give themselves that ethereal, glowing look that screamed, "I might be a ghost." These arsenic tablets were widely marketed and sold as a legitimate skincare solution. Ads claimed they'd brighten the complexion and remove unsightly blotches. They did, because they were killing you from the inside out. Over time, arsenic consumption caused nausea, hair loss, organ failure, and eventual death. But in the short term, radiant skin and the smug satisfaction of looking better than the peasants who weren't microdosing death. As one might expect, this trend eventually fizzled out, mostly because everyone who used it also fizzled out. But arsenic wasn't the only thing crushing women's internal organs. Corsets were doing just fine on their own. The hourglass figure was the defining silhouette of the Victorian era, and achieving it required a commitment to whalebone, metal stays, and aggressive lacing. A tightly bound corset could reduce your waist by several inches, push up your bust, and give you the posture of someone constantly preparing for a duel. Corsetry started young. Girls as young as 5 or 6 were introduced to training corsets, which sounds like a medieval gym program, but with more gasping. By adulthood, many women wore them daily, often from morning until night. And yes, there were health consequences: compressed lungs, misaligned spines, displaced organs, and the general inability to eat more than half a sandwich without groaning like a dying soprano. Still, the hourglass was in, and fainting was a side effect fashionably embraced. Ladies carried smelling salts in dainty bottles for those moments when tight lacing plus warm rooms plus one too many layers of petticoats equal sign dramatic swoon. A well-timed collapse onto a velvet settee wasn't just a sign of oxygen deprivation, it was flirtation strategy. And let's talk modesty, which in Victorian England wasn't just encouraged, it was micromanaged. You couldn't just look good, you had to look good, while pretending you weren't trying to look good. Clothing was layered, high-necked, and designed to shield the female form like it was under museum preservation. Exposed ankles could ignite scandal. Gloves were mandatory. Even furniture legs were sometimes covered for being too suggestive. But that didn't mean beauty was ignored. It was just hidden under 14 pounds of satin and shame. Women used homemade facial masks, made of everything from oatmeal to egg whites. Lip colour was frowned upon. Too suggestive, but a subtle biting of the lips before entering a room was totally fine. Mascara, made from burnt cork, applied with a tiny brush that doubled as a hazard. The eyebrows were groomed lightly, but never plucked too much. Looking artificial was sinful. Natural beauty that took 3 hours to achieve was the goal. Hair, meanwhile, was both a personal statement and a public morality tale. Long, thick hair was considered a symbol of health, femininity, and good breeding. Women who lost their hair due to, say, arsenic wafers or tight hairstyles often purchased human hair extensions, a booming market at the time. And where did that hair come from? Often from the poor, who sold their locks for cash. So yes, a wealthy Victorian woman might attend a ball wearing the literal scalp of her downstairs maid. Wigs were less common than in previous centuries, but hairpieces, pads, and false braids were absolutely in. Elaborate updos required serious architecture, and the help of hairpins, wire frames, and probably divine intervention. And of course, no discussion of Victorian beauty would be complete without mentioning the obsession with fragility. Strength was not considered sexy. Women were expected to appear vulnerable, gentle, and always on the verge of emotional collapse. Even popular novels reinforced this image. Heroines fainted, flushed delicately, and rarely spoke above a whisper, unless there was a piano involved. Despite all this repression, Victorian women still found ways to express individuality and confidence through silhouettes, fabrics, jewelry, hairstyles, and the quiet rebellion of wearing rouge when no one was looking. In short, Victorian beauty was a tightrope walk between appearing chaste and stylish, modest and memorable, pale but not corpse-like, or at least not too corpse-like. It was an era where fashion hurt, makeup poisoned, and breathing was a luxury. But at least the gloves were cute. Victorian beauty tip: if it doesn't hurt, it's not working. After centuries of corsets, crushed bugs, and dangerously dilated pupils, the 20th century burst onto the beauty scene, like a jazz band kicked down the salon door. Welcome to the era of cultural revolution via lipstick, where beauty wasn't just about looking good, it was about liberation, rebellion, conformity, and commercialism, all at the same time. In the words of the 1920s, let's dance, and maybe smudge some mascara while we're at it. Let's start with the Roaring Twenties, when women collectively looked at the Victorian ideal and said, "No thanks, I'm cutting off my hair and voting instead." The flapper was born, not just a fashion statement, but a social middle finger to generations of modesty. Gone were the floor-length dresses, fainting couches, and arsenic wafers. In came bobbed hair, smoky eyes, rouged knees, and enough attitude to light a cigarette indoors without permission. Makeup, once whispered about in moral panic, became a bold public accessory. Women proudly powdered their noses in public, carried compacts, and painted their mouths into the now iconic Cupid's bow, an angular lip shape that practically screamed, "I may not have rights yet, but I do have contour." Eyes were rimmed in kohl, lashes were dusted with cake mascara, and cheeks were flushed with cream rouge. Magazines encouraged women to buy the latest beauty products to achieve that youthful flapper glow, or risk looking like someone's old-fashioned aunt who still wore corsets and believed ankles were scandalous. The newfound freedom was intoxicating, but it didn't last forever. After the stock market crash of 1929, the tone shifted. Fast forward to the 1950s, and we enter the age of domestic glam, where being beautiful meant being the perfect post-war housewife, preferably in heels, a circle skirt and a full face of makeup, while scrubbing your oven. Hollywood became the ultimate beauty dictator. Stars like Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, and Grace Kelly didn't just act. They set the standards for what women everywhere should look like. Blonde curls? Yes. Cat eye eyeliner? Mandatory. Red lipstick? Non-negotiable. The goal wasn't just to be pretty. It was to be a walking Technicolor fantasy, even if you were just making tuna casserole. But don't be fooled by the pearls and pearls of conformity. The 1950s beauty routine was serious business. A respectable woman was expected to cold cream her face every night, use astringent toners that stung like betrayal, and apply pancake foundation so thick it could survive a nuclear blast, or at least a PTA meeting. Every strand of hair was curled, sprayed, pinned, or ironed into place. The bullet bra created the trademark sweater girl silhouette, pointy enough to terrify and uplift at the same time. And eyebrows? Thin, arched, and penciled with the precision of a cartographer mapping the new world. Meanwhile, the beauty industry was exploding. Companies like Revlon, Max Factor, and Maybelline turned glamour into a science and a sales pitch. Beauty advertising was born, and with it came a new, blunt message: buy this product, or prepare to be single forever. If you weren't using the latest shampoo, blush, or deodorant, you weren't just unfashionable, you were doomed. Ads told women that they could be desirable if they only bought the right cold cream, wore the right shade of red, and didn't forget to powder their noses before their husbands got home. The underlying message: beauty wasn't just for self-expression. It was a moral duty, especially if you wanted to keep a man, and God help you if your mashed potatoes had lumps. Of course, not everyone fit the mold, or wanted to. While mainstream media worshipped the glamorous housewife, other movements quietly pushed back. The rise of pin-up culture and burlesque brought sex appeal out of the shadows, while African American communities cultivated distinct beauty traditions centered around hair care, vibrant fashion, and growing resistance to Eurocentric ideals. Still, the dominant image remained: the polished, perfectly coiffed, cheerfully repressed 1950s woman. She vacuumed in kitten heels, served cocktails with a smile, and woke up half an hour early to put her face on before her husband saw her like that. And what was like that? You know, human. It was a strange mix of empowerment and oppression. Women now had access to public life, higher education, and better job opportunities, but they were still being told their greatest achievement might be perfect eyeliner and a roast that didn't burn. Feminism simmered quietly in the background, applying its own metaphorical lipstick, waiting for its cue. In short, the era from the 1920s to the 1950s was a whirlwind of lipstick, rebellion, conformity, and capitalism. The flappers danced into the night. The housewives baked in full makeup. Whether you were daring a bob or perfecting your pancake foundation, beauty had become a product, a performance, and a pressure. Finally, a decade where women could vote and rock a bob. By the time the 20th century hit its middle chapters, beauty had officially become a full-time job, and if you were lucky, a career. The post-war period saw a seismic shift from natural charm and pin-up smiles to a high-gloss, high-pressure, highly marketable ideal that no one actually looked like, without the help of plastic surgeons, airbrushing, and a tiny sprinkle of existential dread. If previous centuries whispered beauty standards, the late 20th century screamed them from billboards. Let's start with the icons. And it's hard to ignore the two ends of the 20th century beauty spectrum. Marilyn Monroe and Twiggy. Marilyn, with her soft curves, platinum hair, and sultry smirk, defined the hyper-feminine ideal of the 1950s and early 60s. She was marketed as sexy yet sweet, glamorous but girl next door, but her image was far from effortless. Her look was a manufactured masterpiece, the result of professional makeup artists, stylists, and yes, some cosmetic tweaking. Then came the 1960s, and everything changed. Enter Twiggy, the teenage model with doe eyes, stick-thin limbs, and a pixie cut that screamed mod rebellion. The new ideal was wife-like, almost alien, an aesthetic that seemed physically impossible without skipping multiple meals and mastering the art of looking detached yet fashionable. Marilyn represented sensual excess. Twiggy brought in minimalism. The message? No matter your shape, the goalposts of beauty would always move out of reach. By the 1970s and 1980s, technology and surgery was stepping in to keep up. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to simply diet or contour. Now you could reshape your entire face, thanks to the growing popularity of plastic surgery. What once was a Hollywood-only secret quickly became available to the masses, or at least the mass-market wealthy. Nose jobs became particularly popular, with women and men alike lining up to reduce, refine, and rebrand their profiles. The rhinoplasty boom wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about assimilation. For many, particularly those from ethnic minority backgrounds, it became a heartbreaking compromise. Fit in or be too much for mainstream beauty. Other surgeries followed: breast implants in the 80s, liposuction, facelifts, eyelid lifts, even chin implants. It was the age of fixing yourself. Have a feature that makes you unique. Great. Now erase it. Doctors went from healing the sick to sculpting the beautiful, all with the bedside manner of someone holding a chisel and a Vogue subscription. Meanwhile, the beauty industry exploded with new gadgets, potions and promises, anti-aging creams, acid peels, home microdermabrasion kits. If it sounded vaguely scientific and vaguely terrifying, it probably came in a pink jar and cost $199.99. And if it didn't work, well, the ad probably said it would in 6 to 8 weeks, just long enough for you to give up and try something else. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse for your self-esteem, along came airbrushing. Magazine covers in the 80s and 90s didn't just feature celebrities, they featured digitally altered fantasies of them. Wrinkles, gone, waistline, slimmed, eyes, brighter, skin, glowing like a photoshopped angel who drinks nothing but glacier water, and pure self-confidence. Photoshop, while invented in the late 80s, really found its glossy, perfectionist stride in the 90s. Suddenly, beauty was no longer real. It was renderable. Models were slimmed, pores were erased, limbs were lengthened until the human body looked like something you'd find in an art student's cubist nightmare. And let's talk supermodels, because the 80s and 90s brought in the big names. Naomi, Cindy, Linda, Claudia, Kate. Women whose cheekbones could cut glass and whose faces dominated billboards, catwalks, and your mum's closet magazine stash. They were dubbed super for a reason. They were rich, famous, flawless, and totally unattainable. The average woman was left to wonder, how is it possible that my face doesn't naturally reflect light like a commercial? The answer, of course, was editing, surgery, youth, genetics, and an industry invested in making you believe you weren't quite enough. This was also the age of extreme diets, calorie counting, and fitness crazes. The Jane Fonda workout era made it clear, beauty was no longer about standing still and looking pretty. It was about sweating, stretching, and sculpting yourself like a piece of organic clay. Jazzercise your way to perfection, or at least to a smaller jean size. And yet, despite all the pressure and polish, beauty remained deeply contradictory. You were supposed to be effortlessly gorgeous, but also invest hours in hair removal, makeup, and sit-ups. You were told to love yourself in the same breath that a billboard shouted lose 10 pounds in 10 days. It was an era of self-improvement wrapped in self-loathing, all sold with a smile. Because the late 20th century didn't just raise the beauty bar, it made it invisible, constantly moving, and somehow available by mail order. Why have a natural face when you can pay to look like a Picasso painting? We've finally made it. After centuries of painting our faces with lead, swallowing arsenic, and stuffing our ribs into whalebone corsets, we've arrived at modern beauty, an age where you can be anything you want to be, as long as it's algorithm approved, slightly edited, and preferably photographed in natural light at golden hour. Welcome to the era of filters, fillers, and fierce individuality that often looks suspiciously identical on everyone's Instagram grid. Let's start with the obvious: social media. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat didn't just change how we communicate, they redefined beauty in real time. In the past, you might compare yourself to the models in magazines or the actresses on TV. Today, you're also comparing yourself to your best friend, your co-worker, your cousin's girlfriend, and a 17-year-old influencer in Seoul with 2.4 million followers and impossibly perfect skin. Modern beauty isn't confined to red carpets or movie screens. It's in your pocket, demanding likes and promising that if you just master the perfect contour and apply one more serum, you too can look glowier, cheekbonier, and vaguely more holographic. One of the defining looks of the 2010s and early 2020s. The Instagram face. Picture this. Smooth, poreless skin, sky-high cheekbones, feathered brows, long lashes, full lips, and a nose that's been contoured into submission. It's 100% unattainable without a mix of makeup, fillers, facetune, and a small army of ring lights. And oh yes, fillers. Once the domain of celebrities and real housewives, injectables like Botox, Juvederm, and Restylane have become as commonplace as getting your nails done. Got a wrinkle? Freeze it. Lips too thin? Plump 'em. Chin too soft? Inject a little definition. If the Renaissance had belladonna eye drops, we've got a doctor named Dr. Mike on TikTok with a ring light and a syringe. But beauty today isn't all about artificial enhancements. Enter the global phenomenon of K-beauty, the South Korean skincare trend that's taken the world and our bathroom counters by storm. K-beauty is all about hydration, glow, and a 12 to 27-step nightly routine that makes you feel like both a chemist and a monk. Cleansers, toners, ampoules, serums, essences, sheet masks, eye creams, sleeping packs. Each promises that with patience and a small fortune you'll one day achieve skin so dewy it reflects your existential crisis right back at you. But here's the twist. K-beauty isn't about hiding flaws, it's about nurturing your skin. It's a quiet rebellion against the heavy makeup of earlier decades, and in doing so, it's inspired a new wave of skin-first beauty culture, where glow trumps glam and a selfie with no foundation becomes an act of courage or very good lighting. Still, the pressure to wake up like this, aka perfectly groomed and glowing, remains, which is where filters come in. Apps like Instagram and TikTok offer filters that smooth your skin, change your eye color, lengthen your lashes, and chisel your jawline until you barely recognize your own face. And here lies the modern paradox. We are constantly told to be authentic, but also encouraged to digitally edit our authenticity until it gets enough likes. Want to post a bare-faced selfie? Brave. Want to use a filter that subtly hides your pores and lifts your cheekbones. Also brave, apparently. It's a choose-your-own adventure where every choice ends in insecurity. The good news? There's never been more diversity in beauty standards than there is right now. Models of all sizes, genders, ethnicities, and backgrounds are finally getting representation. The idea of a standard face or body is being challenged, day by day, post by post. Brands are scrambling to look inclusive. Campaigns proudly feature freckles, acne scars, and stretch marks. Beauty has become political, personal, and at least on the surface, more empowering. But even that empowerment comes with a catch, because now you're expected to be confident, self-loving, body positive, and glowing at all times. No pressure. Just be naturally flawless, fully authentic, mildly edited, always camera ready, and emotionally unbothered by comments from strangers. At its best, modern beauty is about expression, creativity, and celebrating uniqueness. At its worst, it's a never-ending scroll of comparison, self-doubt, and digital distortion. One day, you're feeling great. The next, you're wondering why your face doesn't sparkle like someone else's reel while making matcha. And yet, people continue to push boundaries, challenge norms, and redefine what beauty even means. Whether it's a guy rocking nail polish, a grandma going viral for her skincare routine, or a TikTok trend that turns a zit into a fashion statement, beauty today is messy, strange, and full of contradictions. But it's finally ours to shape. Modern beauty is all about loving yourself. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to live in a city where the roads are dusty, the goats are loud, and the buildings are made of dirt, but in a fancy way, then ancient Babylon is calling your name. Rising out of the Mesopotamian heat around the 18th century BCE, Babylon wasn't just another sun-baked cluster of huts by a river. It was a full-blown Bronze Age supercity, fueled by ambition, ingenuity, and a whole lot of mud bricks. Seriously, mud bricks. If you took a time machine back to Babylon, you'd be greeted by a skyline made of baked earth and stubbornness. Stone was rare, and wood was more precious than a good hair day during the rainy season. So Babylonians became the architects of squishy practicality. They mixed mud with straw, molded it into bricks, and then either baked it in the sun or in kilns, depending on how long they wanted their walls to last before gravity got ideas. But despite the humble materials, Babylon was impressively advanced. This wasn't some sleepy village with 2 sheep and a hut. We're talking organized urban sprawl, with streets, districts, and zoning laws so complex they'd make a modern city planner cry, tears of admiration and mild anxiety. There were residential areas, religious zones, merchant quarters, and royal compounds, all carefully laid out like someone took SimCity, dialed it to 2000 BCE, and threw in some goats for realism. At the city's heart rose the ziggurat, Babylon's not-so-subtle way of saying, we're smarter, richer, and way more spiritually connected than you. These multi-tiered temples were part mountain, part staircase to the heavens, and entirely impractical unless you were a priest, a god, or someone with strong calves. The most famous was the Itamananki, which roughly translates to House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, or as locals probably called it, the really big one we're not allowed to climb. Ziggurats weren't places people casually visited. They were sacred, elite, and probably had the ancient equivalent of velvet ropes and bouncers rid priests with scrolls and attitude. Inside, priests did their priestly duties, offering sacrifices, tracking celestial omens, and occasionally bossing around kings. After all, when your temple touches the sky, people assume you've got direct god access. Down on street level, life in Babylon was booming. Markets bustled with traders shouting over one another about their figs, fabrics, and slightly dented pottery. Merchants sold everything from grain to copper trinkets to exotic imports hauled in from trade routes that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. You could buy a cow, a date cake, and a jar of imported perfume without leaving your district, assuming you could survive the smell. Because yes, Babylon was glorious, but it also had a certain aroma. Between the livestock, the heat, the open-air sewage, inventing plumbing was still a few millennia away, and the generous use of animal fat in cooking. Babylon probably smelled like someone tried to cook stew in a goat pen, and if you lived near the tannery or the fish market, May the gods have mercy on your nostrils. But hey, city life had its perks. Unlike rural peasants still arguing with their oxen in the countryside, Babylonian city dwellers had access to schools, scribes, and temples. Children of elites learned cuneiform by scratching symbols into clay tablets, an early form of homework that also doubled as blunt weapons when thrown in frustration. There were public gatherings, religious festivals, and if you were lucky, a front row seat to the occasional royal parade, featuring real camels and fake modesty. And of course, we must talk about infrastructure, because Babylon was no amateur. Roads were maintained, canals were dug for irrigation and transport, and there was even an early postal system, though it was mostly elite scribes passing clay messages between temples and governors. Still, it counts. You could be fined for dumping trash in the street, blocking irrigation canals, or insulting someone's mother in front of a witness. Seriously, there were laws. Civic order mattered. Babylon might have been muddy, loud, and occasionally goat-infested, but it ran like a well-oiled chariot. At its peak, Babylon became not just a city but the symbol of civilization itself. People from far-off lands came to trade, worship, spy, and wonder at how a city made of mud could be so magnificent. From its urban planning to its towering ziggurats, it shouted to the world, "Look upon our works, ye mildly confused travelers, and take notes." So yes, Babylon was hot, crowded, and occasionally smelled like a combination of incense and animal droppings. But it was also a marvel of the ancient world, a place where human ambition met baked clay and said, "Yeah, we can build an empire out of this." If you like hot weather, loud goats, and getting fined for sneezing in the wrong direction, congrats, you're home. In modern life, if you break the law, you might get a fine community service. In Babylon, however, if you so much as borrowed your neighbor's donkey without permission, you could find yourself facing a swift, serious, and exceptionally detailed form of justice. All courtesy of a man named Hammurabi, the OG legal overachiever. King Hammurabi ruled Babylon around 1750 BCE, and when he wasn't busy expanding his empire or building temples to impress the gods, he decided to write one of the world's first legal codes. But this wasn't your average list of do this, not that. Oh no. Hammurabi's code was 282 laws, chiseled into a 7-foot-tall black stone pillar and set up in public for all to see, because nothing says, "Don't mess with me," like immortalizing your rage in rock. The Code of Hammurabi is often summarized by that infamous phrase, "an eye for an eye." And to be fair, yes, there were lots of eyes being swapped, but it wasn't exactly fair across the board. Justice in Babylon was decided by class. If a noble poked out your eye, he might just owe you a silver coin. If you poked out a noble's eye, well, hope you liked having depth perception while it lasted. Social hierarchy was baked into the legal system like dates into a Mesopotamian cake. There were 3 classes: Awilu free men, Mushkanu commoners, and Wardu slaves. Each class had different rules and punishments, and the law made it very clear that punching up was a bad idea. Literally, punching a noble as a commoner could result in losing your hand. Punching a commoner as a noble, maybe just a fine, and probably a round of applause from your snobby dinner party. The laws covered everything, and we do mean everything. There were laws for bar owners who served watered-down beer, off with their heads. Builders whose shoddy houses collapsed. If it killed someone, the builder's own child might be executed. Seriously, adultery. Men got some wiggle room. Women, not so much. Witchcraft accusations throw both parties in the river, and let the gods sort it out. Babylonian version of trial by YouTube comment section. And then there's Law 22, which basically says, if you rob someone, you shall be put to death. No long court process, no appeals, just, thanks for stealing that sheep. Now prepare for your very dramatic exit from life. Hammurabi didn't stop at criminal law. He also ventured into civil matters, contracts, inheritance, and even medical malpractice. Did your surgeon mess up your gallbladder removal? Cool, he's losing a hand. Truly a place where one bad Yelp review could cost you your grip strength. And while you might think this was all for scare tactics, Hammurabi took it deadly seriously. He believed these laws were handed down by Shamash, the god of justice, and carved his image, receiving divine instruction right at the top of the stone pillar. Think of it like putting a holy watermark on a PDF, just to prove it's official. What's remarkable is how detailed and specific the laws were. This wasn't vague stuff. This was, if a man rents an ox and the ox dies from bad treatment, he must repay the owner with another ox of equal value. Somewhere, some ancient Babylonian had this exact ox problem, and Hammurabi made sure no one ever forgot it. And yes, lazy sons were also covered. If a son raised a hand to strike his father, the punishment was to have his hand cut off. Nothing like a family dinner with the threat of dismemberment to keep things civil. Yet, despite the brutality, the code was actually a step forward for its time. It established written rules, held the powerful somewhat accountable, and gave commoners a legal path to resolve disputes, even if that path occasionally ended in execution. Compared to random vengeance or trial by club, this was progress. Perhaps the most fascinating part is that Hammurabi wanted people to know the laws. He didn't hide them in a dusty scroll for royal eyes only. He displayed them publicly, in cuneiform, on a giant stela. Illiterate? That's on you. But at least the code was technically transparent, like a very intense Bronze Age terms and conditions screen. So what did all of this mean for the average Babylonian? It meant you had to watch your actions, your contracts, your oxen, your kids, and your beer servings. It meant living in a society where justice was swift, public, and occasionally performed by a river with a suspiciously strong current. Hammurabi's legacy lasted long beyond his reign. His code influenced legal thinking for centuries and became a symbol of justice in Western culture, though thankfully, modern courts no longer throw people into rivers to see if they float. Most of the time, the bad news, you stole a goat. The worst news, they wrote an entire law about what happens next. If you thought modern soap operas were dramatic, wait until you meet the Babylonian gods, a pantheon so chaotic, so emotionally unstable, they make Greek gods look like chill roommates. In ancient Babylon, divinity wasn't just about worship. It was a full-blown celestial reality show, starring gods with serious power complexes and an alarming enthusiasm for flooding the earth or swallowing each other whole. Let's start with Marduk, Babylon's big boss deity and the celestial equivalent of a guy who started as an intern and somehow became CEO of the universe. Marduk didn't just appear out of nowhere. He climbed to god-tier power through sheer cosmic drama. According to Babylonian mythology, the world was created when Marduk killed the primordial sea goddess Tiamat, cut her body in half like a particularly aggressive sushi chef, and used the pieces to create the heavens and the earth. And yes, that's the origin story. The earth is made from the corpse of a furious sea monster mum, and we're just living on her squishy leftovers. Welcome to Babylonian cosmology, where your planet is built on drama, trauma, and divine dismemberment. But Marduk wasn't just the god of murdery terraforming. He was also the god of storms, justice, healing, magic, and paperwork. Basically the Swiss Army knife of the Mesopotamian heavens. Once Babylon rose to prominence, Marduk got promoted above older gods in the region, like Enlil and Ea, who probably threw passive-aggressive lightning bolts in response. Babylon even held annual New Year festivals where the king would be symbolically humiliated before Marduk, just to remind everyone who was really in charge. And it wasn't the guy wearing the crown. Then there's Ishtar, the goddess of love, war, sex, and basically making terrible decisions with amazing hair. She's the embodiment of chaotic, hot energy. One moment she's blessing fields with fertility, the next she's marching off to battle in a storm of fury and eyeliner. Ishtar was bold, beautiful, and notoriously hard to date. Literally, myth tells us she once tried to seduce Gilgamesh, and when he said, "No thanks," she threw a divine tantrum and unleashed the bull of heaven on his city. Emotional maturity? Optional, when you control armies and bulls from space. Her greatest hit? A journey to the underworld, to visit her sister Ereshkigal, goddess of the dead. Ishtar strutted into the realm of death, demanding a makeover for her afterlife, and got herself killed, temporarily. She was later revived, of course, because Babylonian myths didn't know how to end stories. They just paused them until someone came back from the dead with vengeance and unresolved issues. Speaking of the underworld, the Babylonian afterlife was not ideal. Imagine a grey, dusty cave full of sulking spirits nibbling on clay crumbs. It didn't matter if you were rich or heroic. You still ended up in a sort of cosmic DMV, waiting for eternity with 1,000 other equally disappointed souls. No paradise, no harps, just eternal spiritual boredom and the occasional god yelling at you from above. Temples, meanwhile, were less places of quiet reflection and more celestial luxury condos for the divine elite. Priests ran the show, and temples were packed with offerings, food, incense, jewelry, beer, and sometimes even music. It's not that the gods needed any of it, it's that the humans really didn't want to find out what happened if they skipped a delivery. In fact, entire cities competed to see who could spoil their gods the most. Some temples had kitchens, breweries, stables, and storehouses, all to keep the god's statue happy, well-fed, and aesthetically pleased. These weren't symbolic rituals either. Priests bathed the statues, dressed them in expensive clothes, and even fed them by placing meals before their faces, mouths non-operational, of course. If the god statue got damaged or neglected, it was a religious emergency. It would be like someone scratching your Ferrari and then refusing to apologize to the spirit that lives inside it. And the gods weren't shy about retaliation. Babylonian omens were filled with warnings about divine punishment for neglect. Plague, floods, bad dreams. That's what you get for forgetting Ishtar's festival, or offering Marduk the wrong flavor of incense. In short, Babylonian religion was high maintenance, deeply theatrical, and constantly teetering between reverence and cosmic catastrophe. The gods were powerful, petty, and passionately involved in human affairs, usually in ways that ended in shouting, famine, or a ritual goat sacrifice. Yet, for all the divine melodrama, the religion gave structure to life. There were rules, rituals, relationships, and when the gods were pleased, the crops grew, the rivers behaved, and the city hummed with prosperity. When they weren't pleased, well, good luck explaining to your neighbors why it's raining frogs and locusts again. They had a god for love, war, sun, and even one who probably handled returns and exchanges. Long before astrology was something your friend used to justify dating another walking red flag. He's a Leo, but like a chill Leo, the Babylonians were looking to the heavens with a lot more urgency. In ancient Babylon, watching the stars wasn't just about personality types and Instagram memes. It was a matter of life, death, and very stressed out kings. You see, Babylonian astronomy and astrology were one and the same, and both were taken extremely seriously. The line between science and superstition was blurrier than a clay tablet left out in the rain. The movements of stars and planets weren't just cosmic ballet, they were divine emails from the gods, packed with omens about war, famine, floods, and of course, royal embarrassment. And who read these heavenly emails? The scholars of the temple planetariums. Yes, that's right. Temples also doubled as star-watching headquarters, because apparently the gods demanded multitasking. These scholars weren't just guys with beards and spare time, they were professional astronomer priests, trained to track celestial patterns with obsessive detail, and the patience of someone waiting for Mercury to stop being weird. They recorded everything: planetary positions, moon phases, star alignments, weird weather, unexplained animal behavior. If a goat sneezed the wrong way during a full moon, someone etched that down in cuneiform just in case it meant something. Thousands of these observations were etched onto clay tablets, many of which have survived, giving modern researchers plenty to translate, catalogue, and quietly freak out over. And the Babylonians didn't just look at the sky, they calculated it. Using basic arithmetic and their trademark confusing base 60 number system, they created some of the earliest accurate lunar calendars. They predicted eclipses with eerie precision, and when an eclipse did happen, it was not a moment for poetry and ooh, pretty. It was a 5-alarm existential crisis. Why? Because eclipses were considered cosmic warning signs, and not the kind that meant bring an umbrella. A lunar eclipse could mean death for the king, famine for the people, or a particularly awkward harvest festival. The court would immediately take action, sometimes placing a fake king as substitute ruler on the throne, while the real king hid in a safe room, eating figs and sweating profusely. Imagine that you're a servant, and one day someone tells you, surprise, you're king for 3 days. Please don't enjoy it too much, because then we'll probably sacrifice you just to be safe. The Babylonian version of take one for the team was deeply literal, but while celestial events brought panic to the palace, they also brought power to the priesthood. The star readers were advisors, forecasters, and sometimes the ultimate buzzkills. If Jupiter was in the wrong place, They'd recommend postponing royal weddings, invasions, or public feasts. The king might rule the city, but the priests ruled the sky schedule, and nothing happened unless the heavens gave a vaguely favorable Yelp review. Their system was so refined that the Babylonians eventually built the basis of the zodiac, the one still used today, minus a few tweaks, and a lot less human sacrifice. They divided the sky into 12 sections, each named after constellations sound familiar: Aries, Taurus, Leo. They all had Mesopotamian grandparents. It turns out your horoscope today owes everything to a Babylonian staring at the sky, while desperately hoping Saturn wasn't up to something shady. But don't be fooled, this wasn't fortune-telling for fun, it was serious statecraft. Babylonian astrology was an official government department. The stars were a warning system, an intelligence network, and a diplomatic tool all rolled into one. Sending omens to foreign kings? Absolutely. Manipulating calendar dates to make a ruler's reign sound extra epic? Of course. Who needs propaganda when you have the Milky Way? And it wasn't just kings getting in on the action. There's evidence that ordinary Babylonians also believed in celestial omens, maybe not with full astrological charts, but enough to believe that certain days, star positions, or eclipse shadows could bring good luck or very bad business deals. It was part religion, part math, part cosmic anxiety spiral. Of course, being a Babylonian astronomer wasn't all glory and stargazing. You had to chisel numbers into tablets using a stylus, memorize complicated cycles, and probably get blamed if the crops failed. If your forecast didn't pan out, you couldn't just blame Mercury retrograde. You had to explain to an increasingly cranky king why Saturn's position didn't stop that surprise flood or rebellion. And yet, despite the pressure, the Babylonians laid the foundation of all future astronomy. The Greeks copied them. The Romans tweaked them. Even medieval Islamic scholars translated their works, giving rise to modern science. In short, we owe our modern star-chasing habits to these anxious, math-obsessed temple nerds who looked at the night sky and thought, we should absolutely take this personally. If Mercury was in retrograde, it meant the king might die or stub his toe. Either way, panic. Welcome to the ancient Babylonian kitchen, where dinner was cooked with love, spice, goat fat, and possibly mild despair. While modern diets might obsess over carbs, calories, and kale, the Babylonians had a much simpler culinary checklist. Will it fill me up? Will the gods be pleased? Will this kill me immediately? If the answer to the first two was yes, and the third was probably not, bon appetit. Let's start with beer, because for Babylonians, this wasn't just a party beverage, it was a way of life. Beer wasn't reserved for weekend celebrations or sad breakups. It was a daily dietary staple, hydrating the masses, and keeping everyone just buzzed enough to ignore the heat, their legal troubles, and the smell of the fish market. But Babylonian beer was not the golden fizzy lager you're picturing. No, it was more like a chewy barley smoothie with floating grain chunks, a questionable smell, and enough sediment to qualify as soup, which is why they drank it using long reed straws, not because they were being hipster pioneers, but because no one wanted to fish soggy barley out of their teeth. They literally sipped their meals through straws, like a society that accidentally invented protein shakes 3,500 years ahead of schedule. And because barley was the cornerstone of both beer and bread, Babylonian cuisine was basically a tribute to this one grain. Bread came in dozens of varieties: flatbreads, thick loaves, and ritual cakes, all of them roughly the density of a small brick. Bread was so important that wages were sometimes paid in loaves, and official rations often included daily allocations of bread and beer. It was like getting a paycheck in sandwiches and six-packs. Honestly, not the worst idea. Onions were another essential. Babylonians cooked with leeks, garlic, and a tragic amount of onions, enough to make any modern recipe developer cry, both literally and emotionally. Add some dates, lentils, cucumbers, and wild herbs, and you've got a basic Bronze Age stew, hearty, slightly sweet, and almost definitely too hot to eat, because you made it in a clay oven during summer. But not all meals were humble. Feasting was a serious affair in Babylon, especially when the gods were invited. And by invited, we mean forcibly offered elaborate meals in temples multiple times a day, whether they were hungry or not. The priests would prepare tables of roast meat, beer, fruits, and cakes, and present them to the god statues, who, as always, looked politely disinterested. It's hard to express gratitude when your face is carved out of basalt. Still, the offerings had to be perfect. You couldn't skimp on spice or serve half-burned meat or, heaven forbid, forget the onions. Doing so risked divine wrath, famine, pestilence, or at least a very stern omen. Meanwhile, the leftovers conveniently went to the priests, making temple duty the original all-you-can-eat buffet job. The elite, of course, dined like royalty, because they were royalty. Their tables groaned with lamb, duck, and fish from the Euphrates, seasoned with imported spices and washed down with finer, less chewy beer. They had meat stews thickened with barley and flavored with cumin, coriander, and possibly a light dusting of regional conquest. Their banquets were social, religious, and political events, all rolled into one. And yes, there were rules about where you sat and who got the biggest portion of roasted goat. Babylonian dinner parties were part feast, part passive-aggressive power display. Even the soldiers and laborers weren't completely forgotten. We have clay tablets listing daily rations issued to workers: beer, bread, onions, and occasionally oil. It's not glamorous, but it kept armies marching, temples running, and builders building questionable staircases to the heavens. Food was fuel, but it was also status, ritual, and survival. And speaking of rituals, Babylonian cookbooks existed. Kind of tablets like the Yale Culinary tablet contain what may be the oldest known recipes, though recipe is a generous word. Think instructions like boil meat, add herbs, stir, cook until done. It's like a prehistoric version of your grandma's verbal cooking guide, minus the emotional guilt and exact measurements. Still, it proves they weren't just tossing ingredients into a pot and hoping for magic. They had culinary intent, and at least one person trying to write it all down before getting attacked by a stray ox. Of course, food wasn't always safe. Storage was a problem. Spoilage was common. And if you were poor, your meals might be 90% barley, 10% despair. But if you had a few onions, some lentils, and the will to mash it into something vaguely edible, you were surviving just fine. Add beer to that mix, maybe something a little less chewy, and you were practically living the Mesopotamian dream. So next time you open a bag of chips or microwave a ready meal, remember your ancient Babylonian counterpart probably spent half the day baking bread, praying over a stew, and trying not to offend a god with lukewarm beer. Simpler times? Maybe. Grazier? More onion-filled times? Absolutely. They drank beer with a straw, because chewing your booze was a little too uncivilized. We've all had that moment staring at a math problem, eyes glazing over, wondering which cruel civilization cursed us with algebra. Well, you can blame the Babylonians. Long before calculators, whiteboards, or desperate Google searches, these dusty geniuses invented some of the world's first real math homework, and they didn't mess around. Let's start with the base 60 number system, which is as bizarre as it sounds. While today we use a base 10 system, because, conveniently, we have 10 fingers, the Babylonians looked at that and said, no thanks, 60 is better. They used sexagesimal math, which means everything counted in units of 60. 60 seconds in a minute? 60 minutes in an hour? That's all Babylon, baby. Why 60? Probably because it's divisible by a lot of numbers. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All go into it nicely. That made it excellent for calculating things like astronomical cycles, geometry, and complex fractions, and terrible for anyone trying to do long division on a clay tablet after 2 beers and a plate of lentils. But the Babylonians weren't just crunching numbers for fun, they were solving real problems. Tax records, food rations, land division, trade transactions, temple budgets. It was all tracked using cuneiform math on clay tablets that doubled as both legal documents and rudimentary accounting software, with 0 password protection and a 100% chance of cracking if you dropped it. These weren't primitive scribbles either. Some of their surviving tablets include equations, square roots, and even early trigonometry. There's one legendary tablet called Plimpton 322, which contains a list of Pythagorean triples over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was even born. Somewhere, a Babylonian math teacher was muttering, "I told you triangles mattered," and they didn't just do geometry, they used it. Babylonian surveyors employed geometry to measure fields, dig irrigation canals, and build structures including those giant ziggurats we mentioned earlier. Using ropes, pegs, and what was essentially pre-GPS brainpower, they laid out straight lines, right angles, and property boundaries that even modern civil engineers might squint at. Their math even extended into astronomy and calendars, which, as covered in Chapter 4, meant tracking lunar months, predicting eclipses, and calculating the appearance of Venus without the luxury of telescopes or caffeine. It's likely they figured out things like solar year lengths, and they were certainly accurate enough to warn kings when to freak out about planetary alignments, which, to be fair, was all the time. But perhaps most impressive of all, they showed their work. Babylonian tablets often include step-by-step solutions, written in meticulous cuneiform by scribes, who probably muttered ancient equivalents of partial fractions again over their styluses. These scribes were trained in scribal schools, which were basically the original math boot camps, except instead of notebooks you got clay and humiliation, a common school exercise, solving word problems like, a field of this size has this many workers who can harvest this much grain. How long will it take before the gods curse you for not delivering the harvest on time? Okay, maybe not in those exact words, but the pressure was real. Failure wasn't just about bad grades. It could mean legal trouble or ritual embarrassment. And let's talk about what writing numbers in base 60 actually looked like. Babylonians didn't use digits like 1, 2, 3. They used combinations of wedge-shaped marks, which represented units 1s and 10s 10s. Imagine trying to distinguish 32 from 132 based on a handful of oddly angled lines and clay smudges, all while your neighbor's goat is yelling in the background. This wasn't just math, it was math without erasers, undo buttons or mercy. Also, 0 hadn't been invented yet, so if a digit was missing you had to figure it out based on context. Basically the math equivalent of trying to guess someone's mood from a passive-aggressive text message. And yet, despite the headaches their system would give a modern math teacher, the Babylonians were pioneers. They created not only the framework for calculations but also an entire administrative system, powered by arithmetic. Math wasn't theoretical, it ran the empire. Want to distribute land? You'd need math. Want to issue beer rations? Math. Want to divide up the spoils of war without causing a fight that ruins the feast? Math. Plus a little divine intervention. Babylon thrived on it, not just as a tool, but as a cultural flex. So the next time you check the time, calculate an angle, or groan about math homework, tip your metaphorical hat to the Babylonians. They're the reason our day has 24 hours, our hour has 60 minutes, and our nightmares have word problems. They invented time, angles, and math homework, with no erasers. In modern romance, you swipe right, you awkwardly text for a few days, and then you either fall in love or ghost each other into oblivion. But in Babylon, matters of the heart didn't rely on butterflies. No, they relied on contracts, dowries, and an awkwardly detailed agreement that involved goats, real estate, and whether or not the bride could make good beer. Let's get this straight. Babylonian love wasn't all hearts and flowers. It was an organized merger, a family-level alliance, occasionally with a side of poetry and light emotional manipulation. From the minute a young Babylonian was considered marriageable, often in their early teens, the clock was ticking, not toward finding the one, but toward sealing a legally binding transaction. And that transaction started with the most romantic of all traditions, the bride price. Yes, love in Babylon came with a price tag. The groom's family was expected to offer a teratum, or bride price, to the bride's father. Think of it as a polite thank you for raising a fertile daughter fee. Meanwhile, the bride's family would provide a dowry, which could include land, servants, jewelry, livestock, and maybe even a bathtub, if they were feeling generous. And this wasn't just handshake and done. Oh no. Marriage contracts were drawn up on clay tablets, etched in cuneiform, and signed in front of witnesses like a Bronze Age prenup, with absolutely no room for we'll figure it out later. The terms were often shockingly specific: inheritance clauses, property rights, expectations around childbearing, and yes, sometimes even an entire paragraph about who gets the goat if things don't work out. One actual contract reads like this: if she bears him children, she shall remain. If not, he may take another wife, but he must support her for life. Translation: you can replace her, but you still have to feed her. These contracts often included lines like, "She shall not go out with head uncovered," or "He may not beat her excessively," which, depending on your optimism level, suggests either early feminist awareness or the world's bleakest loophole. Love, however, did exist. Babylonian literature includes love poems, songs, and flirtation rituals that suggest actual affection did occasionally bloom amidst the spreadsheets. These poems were intense. "Think less roses are red," and more, "May your charm seize me like a storm. May your lips be honey. May your embrace smash my sadness like a temple wall." Who said the Bronze Age didn't have game? Some poems were dedicated to Ishtar, the goddess of love and passion, and occasionally vengeance via celestial bovine. Others were sung during weddings or fertility rituals, where the groom would recite lines promising protection, loyalty, and hopefully fewer snakes in the garden this year. Romance, in its own Mesopotamian way, was alive and kicking, though it may have had more to do with good crops and fewer curses than grand gestures. Babylonian weddings were community events. Families came together, the contract was read aloud, offerings were made to the gods, and the couple would begin their life in a shared household, often attached to the husband's family. Privacy, rare, in-laws, constant. But at least there was beer and plenty of onions. Women could, in some circumstances, initiate divorce, a revolutionary concept for the ancient world. If the husband was neglectful or abusive, as defined by the contract, she could return to her father's home, with her dowry in hand. In other cases, if a man tried to leave his wife without cause, he could be fined, forced to support her, or even socially shamed, which in Babylon meant losing friends, favors, and probably your best tunic supplier. And let's not forget adoption, which was common and very structured. Childless couples could adopt, sometimes even adults, to ensure a legacy and someone to take care of them in old age. Again, written in cuneiform, stamped, witnessed, and archived. It was less chosen family and more legally obligated to visit on religious holidays. As for children, Babylonian kids were expected to honor their parents, marry strategically, and absolutely not strike their fathers. That earned you a public hand-chopping, as outlined in earlier chapters. Sons often took over the family business. Daughters brought alliances through marriage. And while emotional parenting wasn't top of the list, providing stability, dowries, and strict supervision counted as love in ancient Mesopotamia. So whether it was a political alliance, a heartfelt union, or a practical attempt to merge sheep herds, Babylonian marriage was the original. It's complicated. Love poems were optional. Contracts were not. Nothing says romance like, "May your love be firm like a baked brick wall." If Babylon were a celebrity, it would be the kind that reinvents itself every decade, then collapses in dramatic fashion, gets a reboot, and still ends up featured in apocalyptic conspiracy theories. Few cities in history have had more comebacks, collapses, and confusing architectural choices than this ancient Mesopotamian diva. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, Babylon was already ancient. It had seen dynasties rise, gods promoted, walls painted, and laws carved into stone. But as with all great empires, the cracks started showing, and not just in the mud brick walls. The first big oops came courtesy of the Hittites, a group of Indo-European upstarts from Anatolia, who in the 16th century BCE swept down like uninvited wedding guests and sacked the city. They didn't stay long. They looted some treasures, burned a few things, and then presumably said, "Good luck with that," and left. It was like a hostile Airbnb guest, trashing the place and ghosting. Next came the Kassites, who actually settled in and ruled Babylon for centuries. They brought stability, diplomacy, and new art styles, but they didn't speak Akkadian, and for many Babylonians, it felt like watching a reboot of their favorite show. The setting's the same, but none of the characters make sense. Then the Assyrians showed up. Babylon's northern cousins were basically the military jocks of Mesopotamia, ruthless, efficient, and always flexing. By the 8th century BCE, Babylon found itself under the shadow of Assyrian power, sometimes as an ally, often as a hostage. The Assyrians had a love-hate relationship with Babylon. They admired its culture, but also occasionally leveled it to the ground when it got uppity. One Assyrian king, Sennacherib, got especially cranky after a Babylonian rebellion, and in 689 BCE ordered the city completely destroyed. Like dig up the foundations, throw the bricks in the river destroyed. For ancient Mesopotamians, this was the equivalent of deleting the internet and salting the Wi-Fi router. Babylon was considered sacred, even to its enemies. So this act was not just military, it was cosmic blasphemy. But Babylon refused to stay dead. Enter Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon's comeback king, reigning in the 6th century BCE. He made Babylon beautiful again. And by beautiful, we mean jaw-droppingly. Write home about it stunning. He rebuilt temples, expanded the city, reinforced the massive double walls, and turned Babylon into a Bronze Age flex. You could see from miles away. Tourists and traders alike gawked at the architecture, the art, and the royal ego. Most famously, he may have commissioned the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These were said to be terraced gardens that defied gravity and desert heat, built high above the city, watered with an ingenious system of pumps, and filled with lush greenery. Were they real? Debated. Were they awesome? Absolutely, at least in legend. Babylon became not just a place but a vibe, a luxurious, mysterious, slightly unhinged vibe. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon also deported entire populations, including the famous Babylonian exile of the Jewish people, which is why the city plays such a central negative role in the Bible. In biblical texts, Babylon becomes a symbol of corruption, excess, and divine punishment. Kind of like Vegas, but with more cuneiform. Then came the Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, who in 539 BCE conquered Babylon with a genius move. He walked in. Babylon's walls were strong, but the people were tired. The leadership was weak, and Cyrus promised respect for their culture and gods. So instead of a fiery siege, the city just changed management, and many people barely noticed. It was the most polite, hostile takeover in ancient history. The Persians turned Babylon into a regional capital, and under their rule it remained important for a while. But as the Persian Empire stretched, other cities took center stage. Babylon's influence dimmed. Still, it got one last moment of glory when Alexander the Great showed up in 331 BCE, declaring it his future eastern capital. Unfortunately, he died before he could finish his renovation plans or even move in, and the city slowly crumbled into forgotten ruins, partially buried by dust and centuries of people saying, let's build somewhere else." But Babylon never really disappeared. In religion, literature, and pop culture, the name lived on. In the Book of Revelation, Babylon became shorthand for sin, pride, and inevitable doom. In conspiracy theories, it's the go-to label for shadowy elites. And in science fiction, from Babylon 5 to The Matrix, it's still the name you slap on anything big, mysterious, and slightly cursed. Today, the ruins of Babylon sit quietly in Iraq, surrounded by ancient bricks, modern politics, and the occasional tourist wondering why there's a Saddam Hussein-era palace awkwardly looming nearby. It's a site of historical weight and surreal juxtapositions, where the glory of the past and the messiness of the present collide. So yes, Babylon fell multiple times, sometimes violently, sometimes passively, sometimes immediately after someone finished a new wing of the palace. But each time, it rose again, rebuilt by ambition, myth, and a city-sized refusal to stay irrelevant. Babylon fell more times than your Wi-Fi, usually right after a big renovation.